march to the sound of thunder. Taurian banners raised high asunder. Steel on steel, you hear the echoes roar. Good times rhymes with war crimes evermore. Get off our lawn, Starlink scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. From dusty plains to the jagged peaks, we guard our home through fire and sleet. No conquered daunt will kneel or bow. Our cause is just, our time is now. Get off our lawn, Starlink scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. We're snarling thunder, relentless charge. Our anthem shakes the void at large. Bulldogs of justice, sharp and bold. Our legacy's forged in myths untold. We howl for freedom, we rage for peace. Our battle cries will never cease. The war pugs rise, unstoppable tide. Together we conquer, side by side. Get off our lawn, Starlink scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. Woo! From the haze.
War Pugs. Hey guys, what's going on? I'm going to be uploading that later. I love that one. I love the way that one turned out. Guys, it is time for Battletech Tuesday. This is an especially longer one here. This one is, and strangely enough, this is one of the shorter ones that I've seen that is upcoming. So, what's up, guys? How's it going? Caden, Captain Commander, Mad Mergen, Matthias, Red Hawk, guys, how's it going? So, it is Tuesday. I love it when Tuesday comes around. I really love it when Tuesday comes around. And I'm dying right now. Now, we have already heard about this. We have heard about the Starleak's 20-year conquest. 20-year conquest of the Taurian Concordant. And quite simply put, this is one of the greatest get off my lawn moments in BattleTech lore that I've learned about so far. Now, considering what is to come, I think it only fitting that we're going to check out next week the turning point at Tychus. Yeah, this is going to be kind of rough. I'm just saying. This is going to be kind of rough. We're going to be checking out the turning point at Tycross from Black Panther Legion next week. I've already decided on that. And then we're going to launch in. We're going to go back in time to the period of the Secession Wars, and the Secession Wars are something that I am looking forward to in a massive way, a absolutely massive way. But here we are, guys. X in chat if you're ready to go. Is Sven Vanderplank and the Reunification War, where we watch the Baron absolutely get nuked. This, Mathis, this is actually right after the foundation of the Star League. This is right after the founding, where they decided to go, play stupid games and win stupid prizes, and showed exactly how much teeth they had in dealing with what should have been something they should have walked over, it being the Taurian Concordate, considering how the Taurian Concordate was prior to this. But they decided to kick the hornet's nest, and then they got shown exactly how strong they were. Now, I'm going to be splitting this up into 2 separate live streams just because of how long it is. I have been asked to check out the trailer for Tycross first. Tycross trailer. So we will do that. Second. We will do that before we launch into this, but here we go. If I'm going to do part 1 night, you say do another part 2 next week. That's you guys understand what I'm saying. So we're going to do part 1 of this, then next week we'll do part 2, then we'll do the turning point. Sorry, I'm an idiot. It is what it is. This is the turning point at Tycross's trailer. Here we go.
I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair, it may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land, and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill. When spring comes round again this year, and the first meadow flowers appear, God knows 'twere better to be deep, pillowed in silk and scented down, when love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse, and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledge
This is awesome.
true. I shall not fail that rendezvous. Soon.
You gotta love it. You gotta love it. Ha! Nice. Nice. I absolutely love it. Guys, let's get into this. The Reunification War, when the SLDF got firmly told to get off their lawn. Let's go.
The Star League. Even the mere mention of the name conjures images of a fabled utopia where one could not turn a corner without coming across some marvel. When the Star League came into existence in 2571, it was the most ambitious undertaking in human history. It sought to put an end to over a century of constant warfare and peacefully unite humanity behind a single banner. That it existed at all is nothing short of miraculous. But now, 250 years removed from its collapse, after centuries of war and technological regression, the Star League has reached near mythical status among the common citizens of the Ionosphere. Primarily the work of a single man, Ian Cameron has gone down in history as one of the greatest diplomats that ever lived. Only a genius of his talent could have brought the warring factions to the table and helped them find common cause among each other. Legend has it that when the 6 lords of the member states met on Earth to ratify the Star League Accords, as Ian Cameron added the final signature, a single tear fell from his face to punctuate the document. If true, then it would only compound the irony of what would soon follow. Though a great man, Ian was not without hubris. Though the bulk of his work had been done, his final goal of uniting all of humanity had not quite been achieved. Beyond the borders of the Ionosphere and the 6 member states lay the periphery, largely unexplored, sparsely populated, but yet home to billions, many of whom had departed more civilized space to escape the bloodshed and politics of those closer to Terra. This was the furthest bastion. The Star League extended them an invitation. Join us and share in the history and progress of our entire species and all the benefits that would come from a unified humanity. The periphery states politely declined. They intended to forge their own path, and would do so without the controlling hand of the Star League interfering with their lives. Ian was unimpressed.
Yay.
He had not achieved so much to be denied ultimate victory by a bunch of isolationists, nor would he allow them to prevent humankind from achieving greatness. If they would not join willingly, then he would make them. So it was that the first major undertaking of this new galactic government that had promised an end to conflict, poverty, suffering, and so much else was to begin the bloodiest war in human history.
Hooray!
The Reunification War was the first of 2 major conflicts that bookended the era of the Star League. It was a crusade that would result in more deaths in just 20 years than the entirety of the Age of War and man's centuries of expansion into space. No brief summary can adequately represent the scale of the conflict. To do it justice, we're going to dive deep into the intricacies of the war and its major battles, plus the rise and fall
Chomsky,
of
that's
some
a
of the
good-looking
famous
beard you have there,
personalities that
sir.
inhabited that era in time, some of whom had already made a name for themselves in the tail end of the previous era. This first chapter will cover the foundations of the New Age and the trail of disasters that led inexorably to war. When the Star League came into being, its day-to-day function required an army of millions of civil servants to run the vast bureaucracy at the heart of government. These functionaries were put to work in myriad different departments that, among other things, sought to revamp and homogenize the education system across the League, shore up the faltering economies of those troubled nations, help tap new sources of raw materials among the less developed regions, collect taxes from planetary dukes and corporations, and resolve disputes between the member states.
Yay!
The Bureau of Star League Affairs made use of the most sophisticated computer and information networks to make such a mammoth task possible, and towards the end of the era ran incredibly efficiently. The scale of the Star League bureaucracy was far beyond any modern equivalent, but the legions of BSLA bureaucrats were not the only army that came into existence alongside the League. The Star League Defense Force, or SLDF, would help the League to exert its influence. This new military would incorporate some of the brightest and best of each of the member states' own, as well as fully incorporating the old hegemony armed forces. Just like the BSLA, this organisation would dwarf all of its contemporaries and far surpass those house militaries still around today. The Reunification War was a trial by fire for the SLDF. Many blunders were made, but many lessons were learned, and they would emerge from the war as an elite fighting force more than capable of keeping any belligerent house in line. The individual states that comprised the Star League would retain their own identities and also a portion of their former military strength. The right to handle internal affairs without intervention was one of the key tenets of the Accords, and was a right that the First Prince was wise to rarely infringe upon. Though the Terran hegemony would continue to exist as a distinct entity throughout the lifetime of the League, its role would differ from those others around it, becoming the heartland at the centre of all things. Indeed, going forward, Ian Cameron and his successors would think of themselves as the First Lord of the Star League first, Director General of the Terran Hegemony second.
Okay.
By adopting this role though, the Camerons had perhaps unwittingly linked the fate of their realm to the success of the Star League, and should one ever fall, then the other would soon crumble. Going back to the early history, there was still hope among many of the member states that the periphery could be peacefully brought into the League without conflict. In 2572, the diplomats of the BSLA proposed a conference for the leaders of the outworld alliances to meet and discuss the issue further to see if an agreement could be met. Unfortunately, only the Rimworld's Republic responded, with the others choosing to remain aloof. The Rimworlds has somewhat of a different relationship with Terra in particular compared to the other Periphery powers. A century earlier, the ruling Rao-Durant family had peacefully transferred power to their close friends, the Amarises, who held positions within the hegemony government. Though the Amaris family had embraced frontier life, or gone native as some suggested, their prior history helped colour the perception of their realm as the one civilized bastion out on the fringes.
And within a very dedicated amount of time, they would help color the Imperial throne too.
Other attempts were made to appeal to the Taurians by offering them favourable trade deals, which meant little to the industrialised and self-sufficient Concordat, or tax relief agreements with the Magistry of Canopus, but nothing ever came from them. With the failure of the conference and diplomatic efforts, Ian Cameron began to consider more forceful options. He found inspiration and his solution in the Starleague Regular Army. The SLDF was almost a year old at this point and was going through some teething problems. Though they had a staff of tremendously experienced officers, a technological edge, and strong support structure, not all of the donated regiments had meshed together. Particularly at the lower levels, the SLDF had become quite factionalized.
I'm going to take a bet. Karita, Capellans, they're the chief source of the problems.
The creation of this new army had other undesired consequences. The Starleague Accords had required each of the member states to turn over a significant portion of their militaries and discharge those who were no longer needed to meet an agreed quota. The first result of this was an unemployment problem, but later, bands of these disenfranchised soldiers got together and turned brigand, requiring Starleague troops to be sent in to stop them. In one particularly embarrassing moment, CCAF forces came to the aid of their former comrades, now pirates, and fought to protect them from the SLDF. To combat the problem, the Great Houses came up with a devious solution. Those out-of-work soldiers were funneled into the private armies of nobles, or hired on as security forces by major firms. Others formed mercenary companies before leasing their services to those who needed them, a practice that would become widespread going forwards. This allowed the member states to maintain a stronger defensive force than their paper TOEs suggested.
Yay!
The SLDF had a more elegant solution, the United Triumph military exercises. The largest set of wargames ever planned were arranged for the end of the year that would pit the nascent Starleague troops against the House militaries. The purpose of this was twofold. Firstly, it allowed those unemployed soldiers to be temporarily hired back to act as garrisons on the worlds whose traditional garrison were away taking part in the games. But secondly, the United Triumph would act as a warning to the Periphery. The exercises were arranged to take place on border worlds along the edge of the Periphery, in a thinly veiled threat of what was to come if those
I can't picture this going poorly.
governments didn't reconsider their decision not to join the League. If that was the intention, it went disastrously wrong once the wargames commenced, and the scale of the problems within the SLDF became apparent.
Yay!
Time and time again they were defeated by the numerically and technologically inferior house troops. Only the LCAF scored worse during their engagements. Their hopeless performance made them the laughingstock of the very people they had meant to intimidate.
Ha!
Some good came from the United Triumph, however. Firstly, the military leadership learned some valuable lessons and would implement changes that would significantly improve their future performance. Secondly, the passing of the Border Guards Agreement that would allow for the construction of SLDF bases within the realms of the member states, ostensibly to protect from periphery attacks, would benefit them greatly come the Reunification War.
Yes, to protect them from the people that want to be left alone.
If things were tense between the inner and outer worlds, they were about to reach new lows going into December 2572. Around this time, the Outworlds Alliance had clandestinely purchased several companies of battle mechs from some Draconis Combine-based firms to form the basis of the Alliance's first mech regiment. In truth, these were mostly outdated designs, and the rest of the unit was filled out with converted industrial mechs. They had two reasons for the creation of this unit. First of all, the Outworlds was suffering from the increase in pirate activity that had come from the disbandment of Innisphere regiments. But secondly, Trade Minister Grigori Avalar was anticipating a further decline in relations with the Innisphere and had begun a crash armament program in preparation.
Yeah.
Up until this point, the Alliance didn't even have a standing army, and it was left to the individual worlds to look after themselves. By the time news of this reached the High Council, the reported numbers had been inflated to a full regiment of battle mechs. How this happened is anyone's guess. Some have said it was down to growing fears among the member states that the Periphery was their enemy. Others have put it down to a failing of those responsible for not verifying the information, while still others have claimed it was a deliberate act to misrepresent the size of the problem.
I would say it's a deliberate act because there's nothing says, like, hey guys, come together, than a threat that's not really a threat.
Regardless, the Star League decided to take action and force the Avalar family to accept the presence of SLDF troops within their borders to protect from pirate activity.
Of course.
Despite this stated objective, those troops never went close to the vulnerable systems and instead routed around among the more densely populated regions.
Hey, look, check it out. It's also known as Bob.
Searching for the mechs. Also moving troops into the Outworlds was the DCMS, who were also under orders to find the Alliance battle mechs. They were less considerate in how they went about doing this, however, causing untold property damage to the locals.
Thanks, dicks!
The 17th Galadan Regulars Regiment, stationed on Santiago, had raised the ire of the world's natives, and it had reached the point where they were not safe outside of their barracks. During one patrol, an altercation between a gang of children and a frustrated Draconis mech warrior led to disaster when the pilot threw a bottle of coolant at the boy, which burst and badly burned the unfortunate child. An angry mob moved in, throwing stones at the isolated mech. As it tried to disengage, it stumbled on the wreckage of a vehicle and came crashing down on a crowd of civilians. The mob now reached fever pitch and attempted to break into the cockpit. The panic mech warrior let loose with all their weapons, which resulted in several dozen casualties all told. The Santiago massacre was perhaps the moment where relations broke down irrevocably between the two sides and war became inevitable. The Outworlds Alliance was outraged when the mech warrior was brought to trial by the Star League instead of by the Avalar courts.
Right.
Riots broke out across many periphery and even inner sphere worlds, the Magistry of Canopus withdrew from border dispute talks, and most troublingly, the Taurian Concordat began military maneuvers along their own border. It was this last action which led to the second major incident in the run-up to the Reunification War. The world of Malagrotta, peacefully split between the Federated Suns and Concordat by the Omsul Accord signed earlier that century, was an agreed demilitarized zone. The tensions of the era had many people on edge, including the miners on the moon of Fontana. In February of 2573, a miscalibration on the part of a small Taurian flotilla brought the task force unexpectedly into the Malagrotta system, whereupon they found that damage had been sustained to several key components on their ships. They began to move in-system to request aid from the mining colonies. The sudden arrival of a group of warships brought panic to the system's inhabitants, who hurriedly dispatched their own job ships into Davian space to alert them of what they perceived of as an attack. In this age where interstellar communication worked only by courier, there was no way to notify the Federated Suns of their mistake once the Taurians' intentions became known. Jumping in system behind them came a Davian fleet ready to do battle. Though the Reunification War was still a couple of years away, the Malagrotta affair would become the first engagement of the conflict. On one side were the mismatched ships of the Concordat Navy, part of a larger fleet that had gotten separated through a misjump and were now stranded around Malagrotta. The largest was the cruiser TCS Pinard, a Winchester-class vessel and one of the largest ships fielded by the Taurians. In support, or rather equally stranded, were a pair of Wagon Wheel-class frigates, the TCMS Anaheim and Certain, and a small Pinto-class corvette, the TCS New Karachi. A merchant-class supply jumpship, the TCS Ulysses Run, had also arrived with them. A small complement of Manatee and Jumbo-class dropships completed the Taurian fleet. The Federated Suns warship squadron was helmed by twin Davian-class destroyers, the FSS Charles and James Davian, supported by the much larger FSS Jaipur, a new Certus-class carrier. The rest of the fleet was rounded out by a quartet of Vigilant-class corvettes, FSS Batavia, Novaya Zamoya, Point Barrow and Smolensk, and the Robinson-class transport, FSS Woodbine. Also in support were two merchant-class jumpships, the FSS Alcazar and St. Lo. Their dropship contingent consisted of 3 Leopard CV aerospace transports, 4 Manatees, and 3 of the Dross 2A class. The Davian vessels arrived at the opposite end of the system and used the sun to mask their approach. The Taurians meanwhile were undertaking repairs on their damaged ships and were unprepared for a fight. Not all of their craft had yet prepared their KF drives that would allow them to jump out of the system if threatened. They were caught completely by surprise by the Davian warships and hastily moved to defend themselves. The battle was not an even one, with the Federated Suns having the clear superiority in numbers. The Concord Navy fought to withdraw from the engagement but was taking heavy damage. AFFS Marines were dispatched to board the Taurian ships and prevent them from leaving if possible, and were successful in capturing the New Karachi and Ulysses Run. Also falling into their hands were a trio of dropships, and it's possible that these craft were still docked with their parent vessels when the latter were taken. By the third hour of battle, the Davians had taken damage, but lost only a single Leopard dropship, whereas both Taurian frigates had been destroyed by the attacking Fedsun's navy. Recognizing that the battle was lost, the de facto flagship Pinard made an emergency jump that would allow them to fight another day. The Malagrotta affair was a complete walkover for the Davians, who immediately went to Ian Cameron with news that they had repelled a hostile invasion from the Concordat. By this point, the reality of the situation had been discovered by the AWFS High Command, but to save face, they covered up the truth that their admiral had opened fire unprovoked on a Taurian flotilla seeking
Dicks.
aid. Recriminations flew between the Taurians and Davians. When the Star League offered to step in and help negotiations, again offering the status of favoured nation if they would consider joining, the Concordat refused their offer and invitation, claiming they had no right to get involved in a matter that concerned only the two age-old enemies. This incensed Cameron, who encouraged Alexander Davian to move a permanent military force into the DMZ to protect their assets. Across the Inner Sphere, the Amarises were trying to avoid further escalation between themselves and the Star League. As a way to build bridges, Gregory Amaris had invited the Star League to send a battalion of SLDF mechs to the capital Apollo to train their own local forces. Unwittingly, he had just created the spark that would ignite a rebellion within his own borders. When riots broke out, the 8th Amaris Dragoons moved away from their base to pacify the civilians. A group known as the Rift Republic Army took this opportunity to assault the base and the political prison within. Overwhelming the small garrison, they were able to free the prisoners and proceeded to execute most of the staff and officers there. Amaris responded brutally by ordering in the 5th Fusiliers and Republican Guard. Unexpectedly fierce fighting in the streets led to
The Republican Guard. Where have I heard that before?
the compound being bombed, and the mechs killed the survivors as they fled
Activates
from
the
ruins.
almonds.
In the aftermath, Gregory passed the universal act of loyalty that required the citizens of the Rimwell's Republic to swear allegiance to House Amaris and the Star League. Most went along with the sham, but in one instance the 3rd Amaris Dragoons were dispatched to Lakov to force compliance. This only fanned the flames of rebellion further, but it did pacify the Star League for the time being. Early in 2573, Albert Marek the Great passed away and his seat on the High Council went to his daughter Marion. At this time, the council was split on how to proceed with the periphery problem. On the one hand, Kirita, Davian, and to a lesser extent Cameron were pushing for war, while Steiner, Marek, and Liao were still opposed. It was thought that a complete trade boycott could be the tool they needed to force the non-member alliances to comply. In 2574, a staggering 80% of all trade between the Inner Sphere and Periphery was closed off almost overnight, which at first appeared to be doing the trick. However, the Periphery rose to the challenge and demonstrated a level of self-sufficiency that caught many of the member states by surprise, all the while continuing to build the distaste that the distant colonists felt for the Star League. The trade embargo actually had disastrous ramifications within the Inner Sphere when several trading conglomerates who relied on their dealings with the Periphery went out of business, including one megacorp from the Protectorate of Donegal, resulting in widespread unemployment. This was the final straw for House Steiner, who switched sides within the High Council, and now the course towards the Reunification War was set. The Archon Council that to declare war unprovoked would be a foolish error. They needed some ultimatum to shift the onus onto the Periphery. On January 2nd, 2575, the Star League issued the Pollux Proclamation. On the surface, this was meant as a final opportunity for the Periphery realms to realize their error and make peace with the Inner Sphere. In reality,
Their error.
everyone knew that it was a document designed to provoke, and neither side had any desire to sit down at the negotiating table. Before any response was even received, Ian Cameron had tasked the BSLA propaganda department with drumming up support for what he already knew would be certain war. This created quite a rift in the Bureau, as many believed that he had already betrayed the high-minded ideals of the Star League by pursuing a course of war within the first 5 years of its existence.
Yeah?
Tensions grew so bad that Ian would actually fire the head of the department, Mitchell de Grayson, his longtime friend and best man at his wedding. The Pollux Proclamation came with a 3-month deadline, but on March 1st, 4 weeks before it expired, the Periphery's reply arrived on Terra, and Ian Cameron received the lone ambassador who had come to the court of the Star League. He introduced himself as Grendel Roberts, ambassador for the newly formed independent states of the Periphery.
The dude's name is Grendel. This is gonna be a problem.
A union of the Taurian Concordat, Magistry of Canopus, and Outworld's alliance. Their response went as such. At the request of the independent states of the Periphery, I formally reply to your demand that we submit to the Star League or else suffer the consequences. My reply is simply this: rest up, conserve your strength, and kiss your children goodbye, because we have no intention of surrendering our sovereignty to a pack of politicians who think they are important because they huddle around Terra. Real men and women live free and independent of any feeble ideas about the birthplace of humanity and other high-sounding drivel. Real men and women do not need Terra, and if necessary, we are willing to give our lives to prove it.
No. Translated roughly into Low Gothic, they basically said, eat a dick.
So far in our history of the Reunification War, we've looked at how tensions between the inner sphere and the periphery escalated in the first 3 years of the Star League's existence. The belligerent, inconsiderate, and negligent actions of those in power created a situation where armed conflicts had become inevitable. In 2575, humanity was on the precipice, and the Pollux Proclamation was the final push. Because the Reunification War was the largest in history, encompassing the entire human sphere, and the first time all the great nations have been involved in a single interstellar conflict, to prevent us from becoming bogged down later on, we'll begin with an overview of each state and a breakdown of their military might. The primary antagonists and instigators of the war were the 6 member states of the Star League, led by First Lord Ian Cameron, the Director General of the Terran Hegemony. His allies were the State Lords, Marion Marek, Captain General of the Free Worlds League, Ursula Liao, Chancellor of the Capellan Confederation, Viola Steiner Dinesen, Archon of the Lyran Commonwealth, Alexander Davian, First Prince of the Federated Suns, and Hiro Kurita, Coordinator of the Draconis Combine. Arrayed against them were the Independent States of the Periphery, or ISP, which included the Taurian Concordat, led by Protector Mitchell Calderon, the Magistry of Canopus, led by Magistrix Crystallis Centrella, the Outlaws Alliance, led by President Grigori Avalar. Also fighting for their independence against the Star League, but not allied with the ISP, was the Rimwell's Republic, helmed by First Consul Gregory Amaris. Before reviewing the TOEs, a brief note on organisation. As discussed in a prior chapter on the development of battle mechs, mech units were organised along the same lines as armour groups, but the Reunification War would mark the first time that larger formations were deployed as a single unit. Most of the Inner Sphere used the term brigade to group regiments of shared history or lineage, but the SLDF would continue the structure of multiples of 3 upwards, 3 regiments to a brigade and 3 brigades to a division, which were the largest formation assigned to fight a single battle. At the top level were the Corps, consisting of 3 divisions, but these were allocated for campaigns as opposed to single planetary invasion. The smallest and newest military to contest the war was the Outlaws Alliance Militia, created in 2572, nominally under the command of President Grigori Avalar, but that delegated to Militia Senior Chairman Welkins Nord. At the outset of the war, the OAM consisted of 49 infantry regiments, 32 armour regiments, 4 aerospace fighter regiments, and the 1st Alliance Battle Mech Regiment. The core of the OAM strength came from 4 armoured divisions, each consisting of 4 armour and 5 infantry regiments.
Alright.
Each division was responsible for the defence of 2 or 3 priority worlds. The rest of the planets were garrisoned by local militia forces, supported by the remainder of the OAM's line regiments. Volunteer militia would play a part in the defence of all the periphery states. Their biggest weakness was their scarcity of mechs and complete lack of warships. The 1st Alliance Battle Mech Regiment was never deployed in force, instead being dispersed among the other formations, severely hampering their offensive abilities. Without a fleet, they were not able to engage Star League forces in space, or prevent naval blockades of their systems.
Which they're going to get stomped out, I do rightfully believe. I mean, there is no... Like, this is the thing, I know about the Taurian Concordant, but what I do not know is how the rest of them fared, and just hearing this, they're going to get stomped out.
A large percentage of the OAM were expats, mostly unemployed soldiers, including Welkins Nord, a former DCMS Razelhag district officer. The middle power of the ISP was the Magistry Armed Forces, traditionally led by the Magistrix, but during the Reunification War this task was given to Colonel Adam Buquois. Though the MAF dated to 2531, it was only during the recent escalating tensions that it had expanded beyond a loosely organised militia force. The core of the MAF were 11 battle mech regiments, which included the 4 regiments of Canopian Light Horse from the Chasseurs au Cheval Brigade, 3 of Canopian Fusiliers, 2 Canopian Grenadiers, the Canopian Cuirassiers, and the Crystallis Centrala's own Magistrix Guard. Further support came from 12 mixed mech and armour Home Guard regiments, dispersed across the realm to bolster militia fighters. Canopian naval strength was a paltry 11 warships, plus a number of smaller craft to bring it up to 130 vessels altogether, divided into 2 small fleets. To further expand their military capabilities, the Magistry had used its considerable fortunes to hire on 6 mercenary regiments, including Buquois bandits, whose colonel would devise the defensive strategy for the entire state. By far the strongest member of the ISB was the Taurian Defense Force, with Protector Mitchell Calderon acting as senior marshal. An appointed Chief of Staff, Marshal Lucinda Grimm, and a trio of deputy marshals commanded the Army, Navy, and volunteer forces. The TDF possessed a total of 24 battlement regiments, that was 5 Taurian Guard, 9 Concordat Chasseurs, 4 Concordat Velites, 5 Pleiades Hussars, and the Calderon Red Hand. Operationally, these were divided into 6 combined arms corps, containing anywhere from 2 to 6 mech regiments. The first corps was responsible for the inner worlds, the second covered the Capellan border, the third protected the Pleiades cluster, the fourth was further spinward along the Federated Suns border, and the fifth was arrayed near the Badlands cluster.
Okay.
The Guard Corps was the last line of defense at the Hyades cluster. Individual worlds also fielded Volunteer Guard mixed regiments. There were a total of 14 of these, though some were only 1 or 2 battalions strong, and together they would bring the total number of Taurian battle mechs to around 33 regiments. These were supported by 7 independent aerospace regiments and almost 100 armour. But in addition to this, the Taurians had an ace in the hole. An enormous flotilla of 127 warships divided into 4 fleets patrolled their borders, a naval strength greater than any single member state and many times larger than all the other periphery vessels combined. This aspect of the TDF more than any other made them the most dangerous of all the targets the Star League would go after during the Reunification War.
Shit.
The Rimworld's army was more decentralized than their contemporaries, and no single individual claimed overall command. A strategos, senior general, controlled numerous units within the region, but each acted independently. A total strength of 25 combined arms regiments came from 8 Amaris Dragoons, 8 Amaris Fusiliers, 7 Amaris Legionnaires, and the 2 Household Guard units of the 1st Consul Gregory Amaris, the Republican Guard and Tartan Brigade. The battle mech strength of these units was equal to approximately 6 regiments. Their fleet had a nominal strength of 17 warships, but 3 of these were in disrepair and would be non-functional for the duration of the conflict.
So Russia.
The decentralized nature of the RWA would both help and hinder them, making it difficult to mount an organized defense, but challenging for the Star League troops to cut off the head of the shark. Total strength for the ISB was 51 battle mech regiments, 57 if you include the RWA. In theory, even the smallest of the member states could match this, but in these early days of the Star League, internal distrust would affect how much of their militaries they were prepared to send on the offensive. The ISB possessed 138 warships, plus 14 in the Rimworlds, but the lion's share of these belonged to the Concord Navy. Only the Taurians could conduct a traditional campaign using their military. The rest would spend the war relying heavily on guerrilla tactics. Moving on to the Star League forces, we'll begin with the oldest of the member states, the Freeworlds League military. In 2575, this was the largest of all the armies outside the SLDF, and was commanded by Captain General Marion Manick. 115 battlement regiments were dispersed across the League, a mix of both federal and provincial forces. The core of these was the Maric Militia, which in the Freeworlds have a very distinct offensive purpose, and should not be confused with the planetary or regional militias of other realms. Other federal brigades included the Atrian Dragoons, Freeworlds Guards, and the newly formed Bolan Defenders, a semi-autonomous command inhabiting the Bolan salient within the Lyran Commonwealth. Provincial brigades were the Maric Guard, Fusiliers of Orient, Orient Hussars, Regulan Hussars, Defenders of Andurian, and Stuart Dragoons. A fleet of 75 warships guarded the realm.
Not gonna say it, but yeah. Suck it, Capellans.
The FWLM, like all Inner Sphere militaries, is in the process of being downsized. SLDF contributions prior to 2575 consisted of 14 federal regiments, 11 provincial regiments, and 40% of their warships. The classification of those regiments is unknown.
Whew.
The Trachonas Combine Mustered Soldiery was one of the premier fighting forces within the Inner Sphere, commanded by Coordinator Hihiro Kurita. The main body of the 94 battle mech regiments came from the 5 military districts, the Benjamin, Deiron, Galadon, Pesht, and Razelhag regulars. 2 free-floating brigades, the Arkab Legion and Proserpina Hussars, bolster the strength where needed, and these were supported by the Sunzang Military Academy cadre. The elite of the DCMS is the Sword of Light Brigade. The Draconis Combine Admiralty commands a fleet of 49 warships, making them one of the weakest naval powers. This is partly because they donated 57 warships, more than half their fleet, to the SLDF, plus an additional 39 regiments of unknown forces.
Okay.
The LCAF was the sole exception among the Ionosphere powers in that although nominally under the command of Archon Viola Steiner-Dinesen, General of the Armies Michael Gilchrist was the man actually responsible for running the wartime operations. The LCAF matched their Spinward neighbours with 96 battlemech regiments. The Commonwealth uses fewer but larger brigades to group its units, the largest being the Lyran Guard, the smallest its diminutive sister brigade, the semi-permanent Lyran Regulars. Others include the Arcturan Guard, Donegal Guard, the Elite Royal Guard, and the provincial Sky Rangers and Tamar Tigers. A large fleet of 67 warships protects the Commonwealth. By virtue of having a border on all sides to defend, the Star League permitted the Lyrans to maintain a fleet of 60 vessels, which in theory is 10 more than the others. In reality, the rising tensions and probable war put decommissioning on hold, and the member states maintain a larger than permitted navy. LCAF contributions to the SLDF were significant but unknown. The CCAF was commanded by Chancellor Ursula Liao. An attempted military coup during the Age of War led to all ranks above colonel being disbanded and leaving the Chancellor's authority on military matters unrivaled.
Nice.
Many smaller brigades give the CCAF a combined battlemech force of 61 regiments. These brigades include the Andurian and Capellan Hussars, Capellan Chargers, Chesterton Regulars, Liao Lancers and Guards, Cyan Dragoons, St. Ives Armoured Cavalry, and the Tikhonov Lancers. 45 warships patrolled Confederation space. The Capellans would have the least involvement of any nation, Ionosphere or periphery, in the Reunification War. They
Of course they wouldn't.
were able to distance themselves from the conflict by making significant contributions to the SLDF. 45 regiments were donated, 16 of which were battlemech commands, and almost 2/3 of their prior warship fleet was transferred, though much of these were old and outdated designs that they couldn't afford to refurbish. The old Federated Sons FBF had been reorganized into the new AFFS in 2541 at the conclusion of the Davian Civil War. First Prince Alexander Davian was first marshal of this army that was still in recovery. The Avalon Hussars and Davian Brigade of Guard had formed the core of Alexander's strength during the war, but opposing him had been the Varnay's Certis Fusiliers, Laura Davian's Tancredi Warriors, and ultimately Rostov's Terran Brigade and Vale Rangers. The formation of the SLDF gave Alexander an opportunity to rid himself of some of the less loyal forces notionally under his command. The Terran Brigade was handed over in their entirety. Those members of the Tancredi Warriors who had switched sides became the Tancredi Loyalists. The Certis Fusiliers were not disbanded but remained under suspicion, and the Vale Rangers who had not sided with Rostov became the Robinson's Chevaliers. In preparation for the United Triumph exercises a few years prior, the Federated Sons formed a new temporary brigade, the Dragon Lords, to guard the realm while the bulk of the AFFS was away. 2 years later, these had still not been disbanded. The last brigade was the Arcadian Cuirassiers, whose lineage went back to the 24th century and the conquest of the Chesterton Trade League by the Federated Sons. All these combined to give the AFFS a strength of 88 battlemech regiments after the transfer of 37 regiments of unknown composition to the SLDF.
This should have been an absolute pub stomp. It really, really should have been a pub stomp.
The Federated Sons Navy...
No, Kenneth, this was... To be honest, I only know about the Taurian Concordant. I don't know too much about the others. But this was a brutal war. This wasn't World War II. This was something different.
Which had once numbered around 150 warships at the outset of the Civil War, was now in serious disrepair. A third of those vessels had been lost during the war, and a further 23 given to the SLDF, leaving them with only 78. This may have been enough to deter their Ionosphere rivals, but now they were facing the TDF, who possessed the strongest navy in the periphery with half again as many warships. This would have serious ramifications during the Reunification War.
Ha!
These 5 member states had a combined strength of 454 battlemech regiments and 314 warships. Most of these would remain in garrison throughout the Reunification War, but it should be...
Look at this number disparity. The only area in which any of the outer worlds have a chance is the Taurian Concordant here, with the amount of warships that it does, but it's utterly dwarfed by the House Guards.
Clear just how much of an uphill battle it would be for the periphery, and this was only half of the picture though. By far the largest and most powerful army in the Inner Sphere was the Star League Defense Force, both the Navy and the regular army. The highest authority within the SLDF was Commanding General and Ian's wife, Chandra Noroff Cameron. The entirety of the Hegemony armed forces had been incorporated into this new military, and their strength had been doubled by contributions from the member states. The size of the SLDF was such that it was organized into larger formations than any of its contemporaries. 10 colossal regular army corps were split across the Star League, one for each of the 6 military regions and 4 with additional duties. The 1st Terran Corps would be solely responsible for the defense of humanity's homeworld. The 2nd Regilian would handle the rest of the Terran hegemony, the 3rd Alterian the Draconis Combine, 4th Fomalhaut Federated Suns, 5th Syrian Capellan Confederation, 6th Aston Lyran Commonwealth, and 7th Procyon Free Worlds League. Additionally, there were 2 reserve corps, each split into 3 divisions to bolster the defense of the member states. Rarely would any more than a third of the reserve corps be on active duty though. The last and most prestigious was the Starguard Corps, who were responsible for the protection of Unity City, First Lord Ian Cameron and the rest of the Council Lords. Theoretically, each military region would be assigned an SLDF army to protect it, but in this early stage of the SLDF's history, only the Terran hegemony met this organizational strength, and the others would rely on house troops to fill out the remainder. Armies, like smaller formations, were notionally a unit of 3 corps, but during the Reunification War they were ad hoc units assigned to the 4 task forces responsible for the 4 campaigns. With 10 corps, the regular army had an equivalent of 270 regiments, but early SLDF doctrine called for combined arms all the way down to a regimental level. Each corps consisted of 9 battlemech regiments, 9 armour and 9 infantry, but within these regiments only 2 battalions were the dominant unit type. Therefore, in comparison to the other armies of the Inner Sphere, the actual number of battlemechs was equivalent to somewhere between 90 and 120 regiments.
Good God!
Regardless, it was a number many times that of what the periphery could field. Lastly, the Star League Navy consisted of a mammoth 507 warships, a little under half of which were donors from the member states. This
should have been, like, just the numbers alone, this should have been an absolute epic ass whipping.
One aspect in which the early SLDF could achieve their target of matching the combined forces of each member state. Overall, the Star League could field approximately 550 battlemech regiments, 10 times that of the periphery, and over 800 warships, 5 times the periphery figure. And so, the lines had been drawn, the numbers had been tallied, and the SLDF was confident in their conservative prediction that the war would take no more than 5 years. Some optimists claimed as little as 6 months would be needed to subjugate the periphery realms. Few of these generals would last
We'll be home by Christmas, guys!
the 20 years of carnage that was about to begin. When the independent states of the periphery announced themselves to the Star League through their
This is why I wanted to watch something like this. My God. Oh.
rejection of the Pollux Proclamation, the response was not long in coming. Within a couple of days, the High Council had voted in favour of beginning a war against the ISB. There were still dissenting voices among the State Lords. Marion Marek and Ursula Liao spoke in opposition, but both accepted the decision of their peers. Notably though, one of the Outer Realms stood apart from the others. The Rimworld's Republic, long considered the black sheep of the periphery states, took a different approach. Gregory Amaris decided that the prudent thing to do was to publicly support the Pollux Proclamation, and was able to justify doing so by claiming it was the best way to keep the Star League from meddling too heavily in Rimworld's affairs. This gambit might have worked were it not for his decision to impose a further piece of legislation, the Manchester Directive. This directive outlawed the Rift Republican army which had caused Amaris so much trouble lately, but the RRA was not prepared to accept this lying down. Many citizens within the Rimworlds felt that since House Amaris came to power, much of their cultural history as well as personal freedoms had been lost. The RRA had long been disbanded as a military unit, but had remained as an unofficial veterans club, and membership was a point of pride for many Rimworlders. It was one of the last vestiges of a bygone era. Amaris' decision to make it illegal created a rift within his own military. The first signs of trouble came on April 23rd when the workforce of the Diplas Battlemech factory went on strike. A detachment of the 4th Amaris Dragoons was dispatched to restore order, but upon entering the complex were set upon by the strikers, many of whom were members of the RRA. the Republicans chose this moment to announce the formation of the Rim Provisional Government, whose key goals were to remove Gregory Amaris from power and to resist absorption by the Star League. Amaris was outraged and dispatched Colonel Catherine Dormax, commander of the 7th Amaris Legionnaires, with the 8th Amaris Fusiliers in support to retake the facility. Catherine, though, could not tolerate her orders to fire on civilians, and upon arrival made a decision that would alter the course of Rimworld's history. She threw her support behind the Rim Provisional Government and was able to talk the Fusiliers into following her in rebellion.
Nice!
When Gregory Amaris heard that half of the RWA forces on planet had gone rogue, the reality of his situation set in. He dispatched a ship to Terra to request aid from the Star League and then withdrew to his fortified estate, taking the still loyal Republican Guard with him. Here he would remain, cut off from the rest of his realm, until the SLDF came for him. The remainder of the 4th Dragoons on Apollo stayed neutral. Also on Apollo was Major Bruce Langmuir, commander of the SLDF training battalion at Camp Cameron. The seizure of the starport and capture of their dropships put them in an extremely vulnerable position. The RRA moved to surround them in the hope of cutting off their supplies, but ingenuity and raids would help them build a solid base of resources that would help them last through the siege. By July, the rebellion had spread across the entire Rimworld's Republic and split the RWA right down the middle. Most of the ground commands swung one way or the other, but the same was not true of the Navy. Admiral Hakeem Wabika was unable to prevent his fleet from turning on each other. A brief engagement saw 5 warships either destroyed or damaged beyond repair.
And you don't have enough of them?
This all couldn't have come at a worse time for the Star League, who had already begun preparations for what they had thought would be a 3-front campaign. Unable to spare forces to rescue Amaris or extract the training battalion, the High Council was content to sit back and let the Civil War take place.
Nice.
Within the periphery, the start of the
Why interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake?
Reunification War is often given as the day of the Pollux Ultimatum, but in truth, it would be over 2 years before the Star League formally declared war, and more than 6 before it began on all fronts. Nevertheless, what did start almost immediately was the gradual transfer of troops from the heart of the Inner Sphere to the borders of the Star League. This was a long, slow process, almost by design, as the hope was that it would give one final opportunity for the periphery to reconsider their decision. It was quickly realised that the SLDF was lacking the necessary manpower to maintain garrisons within the Inner Sphere and fight a distant campaign. Particularly lacking were the transports needed for such an undertaking. On April 22nd, Ian Cameron passed Directive 22 that called on the member states to provide additional troops on loan to assist in the invasion. This combined army received an official title 4 months later on August 22nd, the Star League Expeditionary Force, named to better reflect its purpose. Since the SLDF was included in its entirety anyway, we'll continue to refer to them as such to better distinguish between the Star League component and those of the member states. For all intents and purposes, the SLDF and SLEF are one and the same. The planning of the invasion fell to Military Operations Command, who established 3 regional operations commands outside the belligerent periphery realms. A 4th RFC was created in July for the Rimworlds in case the situation deteriorated. An early loss came for the Star League in November when Chandra Noroff Cameron suffered a heart attack. Though she would survive, she was encouraged to step down, and into her place as Commanding General stepped Carlos Dangmar Lee, who would serve throughout the duration of the Reunification War. The MOC quickly decided that the main target had to be the Taurian Concordat. The Taurians were militarily and industrially stronger than all the other periphery realms put together, and it was hoped that a short, brutal campaign against them would convince the others to back down. To that end, 3...
Why would you... That's just dumb. Then you're splitting your forces up. It would be much better to take out the weakest one first, and then you take out the weakest one first, and then you focus on the other 2. Then you can like legitimately just combine your forces all in one place and just have the Free Worlds League Navy sit down there on the border, the Capellan Navy sit down on the border, reinforce them, wipe out the periphery states navies, and just take them out weakest to strongest. It's not that hard.
3 regular army corps were assigned to that theatre, the 1st, 3rd and 4th, led by Major Generals Charles Mainstein Wexworth, Eliska Wright and
Joe Rogan, thanks, bud. Appreciate it, man. You're embracing your inner orc right now. I can't stop laughing at the fact that everybody in town is in full-blown panic mode about a cyclone that's making landfall over 400 kilometers. What? 400 kilometers away? Bro, that's That's nothing to worry about. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it, bud.
Malagat, respectively. Task Force Taurus accounted for almost a third of the entire SLDF. On May 4th, 2575, Wexworth was promoted to General and assigned overall command of the task force, 1st Corps going to Major General Eladia Zanaro. To bolster the regular army, assigned to the task force was the 1st Davian Auxiliary Corps, who were keen to do battle with their longtime rival. This unit was placed under the command of AFF Major General Troy Neville. Also moving into position were 4 Star League Navy battle fleets. All of this accounted for a numerical superiority of about 25% on the ground and 50% in space. By December of 2576, almost 2 years after the Pollock's proclamation, the SLDF was in position. The Magistry of Canopus was a wealthy state with minimal defences, and so naturally became the secondary target of the campaign. Captain General Marion Marek took command of Task Force Canopus. Despite her misgivings about the war, she recognised her duty to lead her forces. Assigned to conquer the Magistracy was the enormous 7th Corps. Recruiting for this unit had been in full force for the last 5 years, and Marion had grown the 7th far beyond the organisational standard. It had a fighting strength of almost 3 traditional SLDF Corps. Also assisting them would be a strong FWLM.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare. Do not, no, damn, what the hell? Stop it. Stop it. You can't aim worth a shit. You hit me in the face, it's gonna hurt. Stop it! Woman, you hit me in the face, I'm going to get legitimately pissed. Oh, stop it. Stop. All right, hold on a second. Excuse me, guys. Excuse me. I gotta handle a problem here. Hold on a second. Come here. Come here. Come here.
No. Ew, you licked my forehead. Ew, stop. Just being a gremlin.
You are a gremlin.
Alright, have fun. I'm going upstairs.
Sorry, guys. I had to handle a problem.
I'm going upstairs, okay, babe?
Okay.
Alright, love you.
Okay. Love you too, babe. Hold on a second, guys. I'll be right back again. Come here.
No, hell no. I ain't coming near you. You're going to slap my butt.
Why would you say that?
Because I know you. You got a shit-eating grin on your face.
Why would you say that?
Because
though?
I know you too well.
Give me a hug.
No way.
Come here.
No way in hell. I'll
Come
keep my
here.
butt against the door.
Come here.
Nope.
Oh.
Nope.
Oh.
Nope.
Come here. Give me a hug.
No, I don't want a hug.
Hug.
No.
Hug.
No hug.
Hug.
No hug.
Hug.
No.
I'll pick your nose.
I hope you get a booger on it.
Ugh. There you go. Are you going?
Sit down and start doing your recording where I know you can't quickly run after me.
Okay, I'll sit down. I'll sit down. I'm sitting down. There, I've sat down.
Alright, get into your work stuff.
Okay, I'm getting into it. Okay, I'm turning on the camera. Here we go. There. See, the camera's on. Everybody's waving. Everybody's having a good time. Okay.
Yeah, well, I don't like how you're pulled out from the desk and everything else. You got too quick of an escape.
You know, the thing about it is, though, you know, don't worry about it. Russell, shut up.
I don't trust you as far as I can fucking throw. I'm gonna sit right here by the door. I don't trust you at all.
Hey, Paisley. Say hey to Paisley.
Hey, Paisley.
Careful when marrying a sister of battle.
Auxiliary Corps under the Captain General's son, General Ian Marek, giving the Mareks a numerical superiority of 2-1 over the Canopians. Stationed along the border of the Outlaws Alliance was the 6th Corps. When Ian Cameron passed Directive 21 back in 2572, 2 battalions of 6th Corps took up positions within the Alliance where they had been posted ever since, as had the 17th Gallidan Regulars. On this front, the SLDF was at a slight disadvantage in ground strength, though they had absolute control in space.
See, this is the thing that drives me nuts. This entire nation here has no standing navy. No standing navy whatsoever. Sweep into it. Take every world that doesn't have defenders. Force capitulation, and then you can move the assets elsewhere. The only thing you have to do then is leave behind a garrisoning force. they went about this war really stupid.
Invasion of the Outworlds was
Leave
on
it to
hold until
Karina.
the Taurian campaign was underway. The chief reason for this was a lack of transports for moving troops. Commanding Task Force Outworlds was
You can go now.
I don't trust your ass.
You can go now.
Nope.
Princess,
I know I am.
darling,
Yes.
you can go now.
Nope.
the 6th Corps Major General Harman Vries. No forces were assigned to the Rimwell's Republic, as it was still unclear who
We're about to talk about the people that have cat girls.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a place called Canopus that has cat girls.
Okay.
Yeah.
would come out on top in the fighting there, or if an invasion would even be necessary. Nevertheless, the LCAF was on full alert all along the border to repel any fighting that might spill over. By early 2577, 7th Corps and their Marek auxiliaries were in position and ready to advance. Marion had hoped to lure the Canopians into an attack against the supposedly under-defended staging posts, actually a ruse, but the Magistrix Command Center was not so foolhardy, and wisely did not make the first aggressive action. Their sole hope for victory in this war was to hope that public opinion within the Inner Sphere shifted to being opposed to the conflict, and an attack into free world space would not have helped that cause at this stage.
No.
On May 14, 2577, Marion's grandson Brian Marek arrived at the Magistracy capital on Canopus. All efforts to avoid conflict had failed, and it was his regrettable duty to inform Magistrix Crystalla Centrella that a state of war now existed between her nation and the Star League. A point was made to say that the Captain General had every intention of sticking rigorously to the Ares Conventions, despite recent talks within the High Council about disbanding them entirely. Centrella responded in kind. It was a mutual respect that would save the lives of millions of civilians during the Reunification War, a respect that was sadly absent from all other sectors.
Yay.
The first wave of the Canopus campaign was a scattershot of 6 different border worlds. Assigned to this task were the triple-strength 19th and 20th Divisions, with each brigade taking aim at one of the systems. First to make a move was the 55th Brigade, when on June 10, 2577, they became the first SLDF troops to cross the border into the periphery. 2 small fleets, one SLN and the other FWLN, secured the Gauderak system jump points, meeting only token resistance, after which they descended on the planet. Latest reports suggested that the first Canopian
If you hit me with that,
I'm not. I'm using it as a weapon to get away from you.
no, the leg's behind me. The leg is right there.
Lighthorse was waiting for them on World, but they were surprised to find only a single company in garrison, which promptly withdrew from the world, giving the Star League the first victory of the war, however minor. The second strike began 2 months later when the 56th Brigade attacked Umka. Here they found the missing 1st Lighthorse, who put up more of a stubborn resistance before withdrawing. There was also a strong guerrilla presence armed with hovercraft and even some converted industrial mechs. These proved a bothersome opponent when trying to home the many islands that existed on the water-rich world, as they could quickly move between the land masses in harassing strikes.
Notice how all the there's a large presence here on Canopus to protect the cat girls.
In the end, it would take 2 months to pacify the planet. Around this time, across the Inner Sphere on the Taurian front, the SLDF was getting ready to launch their second invasion. The Star League Navy vessels were assigned to ferry the regular army corps into the Concordat, leaving the task of border defense to the Davians. All available AFFS warships had been moved to the rimward edge of the Federated Suns and split into 3 fleets. Task Force 1 was based at New Syrtis, TF2 with the Davian Auxiliary Corps on Pampor, and TF3 at the far end of the line at June. The Concord Navy, meanwhile, had organised a 5th fleet under Marshal David Santos, who was busy patrolling the border, shadowing the manoeuvres of his Davian counterparts. Santos had drawn up a number of contingency plans, one of which became known as Case Amber. The goal of this operation was to strike a heavy blow against the Federated Suns, delaying the invasion and preventing the Davian Auxiliary Corps from taking part. Naval strength was one of the few advantages the Taurians had, so Protector Mitchell Calderon gave the go-ahead. The operation had begun earlier in the year, but by September 2577 came to the attention of AWFS military intelligence. The majority of the Taurian warships had been withdrawn further into the Concordat and supposedly had massed within the Pierce and Caldwell systems in what was believed to be preparations for an invasion of the Federated Suns.
That's stupid.
In reality, both worlds were home to nothing more than a Taurian intelligence detachment, who were feigning the presence of a powerful fleet. The hope was that the Davians would launch a strike first to prevent an invasion of their own worlds, and thereby expose themselves to a well-planned counterattack. Unfortunately for the Taurians, AWFS military intelligence correctly deduced that it was a ruse, but unfortunately for the Davians, they mistook its purpose as trying to hide the complete absence of the Concord Navy, which was very far from the truth. The Case Amber task force was indeed in the vicinity, camped out in an uncolonized system near Tentativa. This fleet consisted of almost a third of their entire navy, 41 warships in total, plus additional support craft. At its head was Marshal David Santos, aboard the flagship TCS Samantha Calderon. To take advantage of what they believed was a weakness in the Taurian defences, the Federated Suns pooled their naval assets into Task Force 4 under the command of Admiral Sarah Vincent on board the Davian II class destroyer FSS Lucien Davian. By August 7th, TF4 had finished mustering, and Vincent's fleet of 48 warships now represented more than 60% of her nation's navy, leaving only 30 vessels split between the remaining task forces. On September 28th, she led her fleet across the border, unofficially beginning the Taurian campaign without a declaration of war. The peculiarities of KF travel would play an important role in the coming battles, so we'll provide a brief overview here. By and large, each system has 2 points of entry
Guys, the Baron is here.
for incoming vessels, at the zenith and nadir of that system's sun. The distance from these stars.
I'm going to rewind that just a bit so I can see that order of battle again for the Davians. So, a Baron class destroyer, only one of them. Okay.
60% of her nation's navy, leaving only 30 vessels split between the remaining task forces. On September 28th, she led her fleet across the border, unofficially beginning the Taurian campaign without a declaration of war. The peculiarities of KF travel would play an important role in the coming battles, so we'll provide a brief overview here. By and large, each system has 2 points of entry for incoming vessels, at the zenith and nadir of that system's sun. The distance from these stars and the planets within is determined by the size of that star. Jumping in closer to the center where gravitational forces are stronger is a risky maneuver, but crucially, it is possible. Some of these so-called pirate or proximity points were well traveled, but most were usable only by the most skilled, the most brave, or the most desperate. The meager Tentativa defense flotilla had a scant 6 dropships to defend themselves and were quickly overwhelmed by Admiral Vincent. On the 8th of October, she dumped her fleet into the Pierce system, whereupon Sarah confirmed the AWFS's suspicions that there was no Taurian fleet, and dispatched the handful of dropships that were there. But while they were preparing for the next jump to Caldwell, a courier arrived with news of a catastrophe. As soon as TF4 had arrived at Tentativa, Marshal Santos had made his own move and crossed the border with Case Amber Task Force's 2nd detachment to attack the major AWFS's staging ground at Pampur. Here, the first major naval engagement since the Malagrotta affair was fought between the Concord Navy and what little of Task Force 2 hadn't been absorbed by Admiral Vincent's fleet. TF-27 was little more than a transport group for the Auxiliary Corps, and its 12 warships were far outclassed by the Concordat fleet descending on them. They were quickly overrun, losing 9 warships and 18 dropships. The Taurians lost only a single warship during the attack and a handful of smaller craft, but were able to capture the 3 surviving AWFS warships, including the flagship FSS Chesterton, 3 more jumpships, and a few more dropships, along with all of the supplies those craft contained.
Nice!
This was a major boon for them, and more than settled the score for Malagrotta, but Case Amber was only just beginning. Admiral Sarah Vincent arrived back in the Tentativa system, splitting her fleet into 2 halves as she had done on the way out,
That's
so
stupid.
that she would arrive at each jump point in force, taking the Zenith herself, while Vice Admiral Brimond Davis Peckholt took the Nadir.
That's a bad idea.
Upon arrival, she picked up signals coming from deeper within the system that suggested that there was a small Taurian squadron of 5 vessels in orbit around the 5th planet. She broke off Task Force
Ave Maria.
4-2 and some additional warships, then moved towards the hostile
Be careful,
ships,
Tony.
while Davis Peckholt did the same with TF-44. The squadron they believed they were closing on was nothing more than a Taurian decoy vessel and had played its part beautifully, luring the main strength of the Davian fleet away from the more vulnerable ships. David Santos arrived at Tentativa Zenith 24 hours later with his newly bolstered second detachment, and the fighting began in earnest. TF-41 was already down on strength and was now outnumbered 2-1. 6 warships were destroyed, with the remaining vessels falling to the Taurians. Admiral Vincent had turned her fleet around as soon as they came under attack, but it would be another 20 hours before she could make it back to assist, by which point the first engagement was over. Though still at a numerical disadvantage, the presence of several Davian II class destroyers, arguably the most powerful ships either side possessed, would hopefully swing the battle in her favour.
Nope.
Her hope would prove a forlorn one, as no sooner had she engaged the Taurian vessels, Case Amber Task Force's first detachment jumped in around them, and her fleet of 14 warships now faced 47 hostile craft.
That feeling, when you just know it's bad.
An hour of brutal naval combat followed. FSS Swords Point was lost with almost all her crew when the ship broke in half under sustained fire. Things got so desperate that the FSS Eagle's Eye tried to ram one of the Taurian cruisers, but was also crippled in the attempt, while other Davian vessels were captured by the Taurian Marines.
And hey, look, we got new ships!
4 warships were able to escape the carnage, but making no attempt to save herself from her fate was Admiral Sarah Vincent, who died alongside her entire crew when the flagship FSS Lucian Davian was destroyed. The Davian Vice Admiral, meanwhile, had been drawn further in system in an attempt to assist Vincent, but when the Taurian reinforcements had arrived, he began his about turn. He was too slow to regroup with TF-43, who suffered the same fate as their compatriots when the Case Amber Task Force quick charged and jumped from Zenith to...
This is 60% of their navy. Gone. Single engagement. Finished.
Nadir. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Davis Beckett knew that the only way to escape destruction would be to fight through the Taurian ships and jump out of the Tentativa system. The Concord Navy didn't make life easy on him and were able to destroy a further 5 warships, but they also suffered their first loss since Pampor when 2 of their own were destroyed.
So 2 warships for right around 40% of the entire combined might of the Federated Suns Navy.
The Battle of Tentativa was the largest naval engagement in the history of space combat, involving around 250 ships of various sizes, almost 300 if you include the adjacent...
Yeah, 60%, but some of them might have gotten away. I don't know yet.
And it was a devastating loss for the AFFS. They had begun the war with a total of 78 warships, and Case Amber had reduced that to a mere 29. Factoring in battle damage on the survivors, their fleet strength was down by 75%.
Oh my god!
By contrast, the Taurians had actually captured more ships than they had lost. They had also achieved their goals of delaying the invasion, which was postponed when reports of the battle reached General Wexworth, and likely reduced Davian involvement once it did begin. A less direct out...
Likely? I think they're done. That is utterly... devastating.
Outcome for both sides was the increase in enlistment. Tentativa had shown the periphery that they could defeat the Star League juggernaut, but it was also spun by the Innisphere propaganda as a dastardly sneak attack on the Federated Suns by those periphery demons. For House Davian though, the result...
Yeah, dastardly sneak attack in my own fucking territory.
Was humiliation, and their rivals within the Draconis Combine and Compelling Confederation immediately began to leverage their disgrace to win small victories between the member states. This would play a key part in a significant policy decision made by the Federated Suns later on in the war. Commanding General Lee was forced to reassign several of his units to fill in the gaps left by the depleted AFFS. The 6th Corps was deployed to the Taurian front on the Spinwood edge of the border. Taking their place at the helm of Task Force Outworlds was the 2nd Corps and General Amos Forlow, whose name would become reviled across the entire Innisphere. Back on the Canopian front, with things winding down on Umka, the next 4 invasions began in quick succession. Between October 21st and early November, the 57th through to 60th Brigades moved on Restitution, Cranston, Vaccarel and Buttsforth respectively. The main target of these was the extensive facilities on Restitution that would make it a powerful command centre for the Canopians. To aid in their conquest, the 58th Aerospace Fighters were reassigned to assist the 57th Brigade. The 3rd Light Horse and the 2nd Canopian Fleet had been reported in system, but again the SLDF was surprised to find almost no defenders upon arrival. A short 2-day campaign won them the world by October 22nd. Meanwhile, the 60th Brigade had similar success on Buttsforth, claiming victory over the solitary 3rd Battalion of the 1st Canopian Fusiliers after only 2 days on October 31st. So why was such a priority target on Restitution so poorly defended? Commanding the MAF was Colonel Adam Buquois, who had a very realistic perception of the strength of his forces. He knew that the SLDF could move more soldiers to take a single world almost out of hand than he could hope to deploy if he moved the entire Magistracy armed forces combined. He had to play with this in mind, and so the focus of his campaign was on attacking the SLDF exactly where they didn't expect him to be. His forces were kept highly mobile throughout the war, and avoided straight-up brawls wherever possible.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking,
A prime example of this came on Cranston, when the stubborn resistance from the 1st Canopian Grenadiers delayed the advance of the 58th Brigade and their 2nd Orloff Grenadiers Auxiliary long enough for the missing 3rd Light Horse from Restitution to arrive in support on November 9th. With much of their air support committed in a different system, the 58th took more of a pounding than they would have liked. Nevertheless, their superior numbers won them through, and by the 29th of November, the world had been subjugated, the last of the 6 targeted planets. The final world Task Force Canopus had targeted in their first wave was Vakarel. Here things progressed slowly, as the 59th Brigade's Marine Detachment was forced to clear out the many asteroid mining facilities throughout the system. The planet was defended by Mizelson's Marauders, but by November 11th, the battle for Vakarel had been won. Or so the SLDF thought, until 3 days later when the 1st and 2nd Canopian fleets arrived. This small flotilla of only 11th warships was outnumbered by the SLN's 14th Special Task Force, but the Star League vessels were dispersed among the many asteroid belts, allowing the Canopians to gain a local advantage. Before an effective response could be mounted, 5 jump ships and a corvette were destroyed, along with 2 battalions of the 25th Chasseurs of 59th Brigade, after which the Canopians withdrew, taking their mercenary allies with them. 2577 had been a success for the SLDF on the Canopian front, but the cost had been higher than anticipated. Guerrilla forces were delaying them in their planetary conquests, but the biggest issues were transport and supplies. To hold on to their gains, they redeployed several of their reserve units to the worlds they had taken. Colonel Buquois of the MAF did not wait long before launching a counterattack designed to further slow the SLDF's progress. Though the border worlds of the Free World League were garrisoned, few expected the fighting to spill over from the Magistracy. On January 9, 2578, Buquois instead led a force of 4 mercenary units amassing 9 mech and infantry battalions to Meadowvale, a major staging post for the invasion. Defending the world was the 15th Terran Armoured Division, a second-line unit, but one that had 2 battlemech regiments in its roster. The surprise attack ran into early trouble when the defenders at the system's jump points were able to alert the planet that they were under attack. Once on planet, Buquois' bandits made for one of the supply caches, an attack that drew most of the defenders towards them. Meanwhile, the other units split off to attack secondary targets which were now undefended. The ruse worked, but Buquois' unit paid a heavy price for the diversion, as only a single company would make it off-world. Thankfully for the Canopians, Buquois was among them. At the same time, 3 other planets were being raided. The 1st Light Horse was on Sayonara, and the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers were attacking Ain Tarma. The fighting was thickest on Gurnera, where the 2nd Light Horse came up against the 1st Marek Militia. Despite heavy damage, they were able to complete their objectives before withdrawing. The raids came as a massive shock for Mari and Marek and the SLDF. Clearly, their plan to overwhelm the MAF defenders by sheer weight of numbers across numerous worlds was not working, as the highly mobile Canopians could pick and choose their engagements, keeping them guessing. The Reunification War experienced.
The score so far is the Federated Suns have been firmly shit on. The Taurians beast mode them. The Canopus is losing this war, but they're taking their pound of flesh with them.
A short lull while the Star League reconsidered their approach, which gave the MAF time to rearm and re-equip those units that had taken losses. Though things had temporarily quieted down on the Canopian front, in a Corward direction, the stagnant civil war in the Rimworld's Republic was about to develop. Since the outbreak, the Rim Provisional Government had gone through successive coups and revolutions that had filtered out most of the moderates. The RPG bore little resemblance to the organisation that had first appeared just 3 years earlier. Such a shift had pushed several of the more moderate neutral units within the RWA, such as the 4th Dragoons, into Amaris' camp. The SLDF training facility on Apollo, Camp Cameron, had been under siege for 3 years by now, as the Rim Provisional Government fought amongst themselves as to which direction the nation should move in. Looking to break the siege was Colonel Catherine Dormax, who had become the de facto leader of the RRA, though she wanted increasingly little to do with the RPG. In April 2578, the planet was experiencing one of its regular megastorms. During this
Megastorms,
maelstrom,
nice.
a small team of RRA commandos were able to infiltrate the SLDF compound. Their first objective was to bring down the extensive sensor grid erected around the base, blinding them to enemy maneuvers beyond their walls. They accomplished this in short order, and then moved towards their second target, Major Bruce Lamier, commander of the SLDF battalion. Before they even knew they were under attack, the Major was assassinated alongside several of his staff. By the time the alarm was raised, 7
Wow. That escalated quickly. That really got out of hand.
mech warriors were already dead. Without a leader, the survivors were unable to mount an effective defense and were soon overrun by the RRA troops assaulting the compound. Colonel Catherine Dormax had given orders that any captured personnel within the base be taken prisoner, but her troops were in such a frenzy that every individual was executed wherever found. Reports of the attack were received with shock by the Star League. It had been 3 years and Amaris was still hunkered down in his compound, and the Civil War had shown no signs of progressing one way or the other. Clearly, something would need to be done. Frustratedly, Commanding General Carlos Lee began to draw up plans for a fourth invasion. One other significant event happened on April 30th to punctuate the month and the first year of the Reunification War. After numerous delays and disasters, the Star League declared war on the Taurian Concordat.
Oh, about time.
Troops would cross the border 15 days later. The Battle of Tentativa, fought between the navies of the Concordat and Federated Suns, was the largest space battle in history, featuring over 250 craft plus almost 50 others in the adjacent systems. More than half of the AFFS's warships had fought at Tentativa and a third of the Taurian strength. By battle's end, the Davian navy had been reduced to only a quarter of its former size. But a mere 3 years later, Tentativa would be considered nothing but an appetizer for what was to follow at Robsart, where 3 times those figures would be engaged.
Oh my god.
Operation Bull Run, the Star League's invasion of the Taurian Concordat, began on May 15th,
I see what they did there.
2578, 15 days after the declaration of war. It was a campaign that had been a long time coming, the earliest...
Nathan, this is Star League and all the houses against the periphery. So, so it's, the Lyrans, the Free Worlds League, Capellans, Federated Suns, and Karita against essentially just the Taurian Concordant, and in the northeast there is a force that they should just really walk over. The Inner Sphere is getting its shit ran by somebody they should simply be able to roll over.
Engagement between the two going back more than half a decade to the Malagrotta affair. The invasion had been scheduled to commence the previous year, but Tentativa had resulted in many months of delays while additional forces were moved to the front, which in turn gave the Taurians more time to fortify. The TDF's 3rd Corps added the newly formed 82nd Concordat Chasseurs to the battle mech roster, bringing the total number fielded by the Taurian Defense Force.
Well, Mathis, so far, it's the Federated. The Federated Suns didn't even get dog walked. They didn't even get dog walked. The Taurians just shoved a cactus up their ass. That's what happened there.
At the war's outset, to just under 38 regiments. Since its inception, Task Force Taurus had grown to include a 5th Corps, meaning Wexworth's army now accounted for 40% of the entire SLDF. The first wave of Operation Bull Run was to target a dozen worlds all along the border. The plan called for a wide front to keep the Taurians engaged all along the line and prevent them from striking out into the Federated Suns. Most of the corps were tasked with a pair of worlds, and Wexworth anticipated they would be beginning the second wave by year's end.
Oh god.
The first engagement of the invasion took place in the Ridgebrook system, where the SLN's 3rd Fleet encountered a Concordat warship squadron. 4 of the Taurian vessels were destroyed, at the cost of 3 from the Star League, but also 10 dropships, which accounted for a regiment of casualties before even making landfall.
Oh my god.
That came on the 22nd, when the 1st Royal Division touched down a week after entering the system. The fighting on Ridgebrook didn't get going until 2nd Division joined them a few days later on the 25th of May. Surrounding the planetary capital and the 2nd's landing site was the Golden Ridge mountain range, which had been heavily fortified by Taurian militia. Using large artillery emplacements, they were able to destroy almost another regiment and several more dropships. Defending the planet were the 2nd and 15th Fortress Battalions, but those were the only TDF regulars. Though they wouldn't last long, it was the planetary militia that resisted the SLDF invasion for 4 months, an occurrence that would become all too common as the SLDF advanced. It would take until September 12th for this first planet to fall. One of the units that fought on Ridgebrook was the 43rd Royal Light Horse. As replacements began filtering out to the periphery, a young lieutenant recently graduated from the Royal Sandhurst Military Academy was among them. No one in the regiment knew, but his lancemates were actually a personal bodyguard, as the new recruit was none other than the First Lord's son, Nicholas Cameron. Things went even more poorly on Cutterville. Here the 9th Division faced off against a far larger force, a volunteer guard unit consisting of a pair of mech battalions and 3 armour regiments. The Taurian colonel was an expert at waging guerrilla campaigns, and the invasion bogged down into 6 months of protracted fighting. After half a year, Major General Wright of 3rd Corps had run out of patience and replaced Yulan with Lieutenant General Priest Hammond, someone who was considered a specialist in countering guerrilla actions. Even still, it took a further 5 months to achieve even a partial victory, by which point Operation Bull Run was a year old. 6th Corps had the lion's share of responsibility during the first wave, and would ultimately take credit for 4 worlds taken. They began their moves in July when the 16th, 17th Royal and 18th Divisions landed on Malagrotta, Somad and Armington respectively. Malagrotta, as the site of a significant pre-war naval engagement, was expected to be heavily garrisoned, and so 4th Corps' Amar Legat agreed to lend additional naval support. The 2 SLN squadrons entered the system on high alert, but encountered no resistance. 16th Division took up positions on the various planets, moons and asteroids soon after, and confirmed that the Taurians had abandoned their operations at Malagrotta sometime the previous year. Taurian resistance on Samad was organised by Colonel Maria Rubin, who was hoping to prove as equally troublesome as our counterpart on Cutterville. The 17th Royal had different intentions though. This was one of the few instances of a planetary conquest happening on schedule, as Rubin was killed within the first week of fighting, and the guerrillas largely gave up after 2 months of resisting. The 18th had similar success on Armington, but 2 regiments of TDF armour and 3 of motorised infantry meant it would take until the end of the year for the majority of the world to be pacified. Approximately 1 year after Admiral Sarah Vincent first entered the Tentativa system, the AFS Auxiliary Corps was making another move against that world, this time with ground forces in tow. The depleted Davian fleet could only spare a single squadron of warships, which the SLN matched. The 2 task forces again encountered the Concord Navy, but this time there was no epic battle. The smaller Taurian squadron made repeated long-distance jabs at the Starleague fleet as they moved towards the planet before leaving the system shortly after the AFS made landfall. A brief campaign against a handful of armour and infantry battalions saw the world conquered soon after. Their campaign so far had been successful but slow-moving. The SLDF had only made landfall on 6 planets by the time they had anticipated the entire first wave concluding, and of those 6, many were still being contested. To free up some of the frontline troops, Reserve Corps brigades began arriving in late 2578, which would allow the invaders to move on. With Ridgebrook more or less taken in September, 1st and 3rd Brigades moved on to Rentham, where the young Nicholas Cameron made his combat debut. In the first 6 months, he was promoted to Lance Commander, and within the year promoted up to Company Commander. The campaign on Rentham was brief, but the casualties
Nepotism, anybody?
were high on both sides. By October, 4th Corps' naval assets had made it back to them from Malagrotta, and they made their first moves of the war with the invasion of Anaheim. 12th Division entered the system with the 4th Fleet's Attack Squadron 2 acting as escort. They made landfall on October 14th and initially seemed to be making solid progress. 9 days later, the lack of Concord Navy presence caused the 4th Fleet to recall its assets, but this came at the worst possible moment, as shortly afterwards Taurian warships entered the system and destroyed 4th Corps' transport flotilla. With 12th Division cut off, they had to
You're not stuck in here with... I'm not stuck in here with you. You're stuck in here with me now.
dedicate a significant amount of time to re-establishing lines of communication, slowing the ground campaign. The rest of 4th Corps moved to Anaheim in support in early 2579. 16th Division finally found the naval battle they had been looking for in Malagrotta when they moved to Estwan in November. The SLN detachment was too strong for the Taurian defenders, who lost a corvette and a pair of dropships in their attempt to prevent the regular army from making landfall. Last of the Taurian worlds to see action in 2578 was Trauson, the AFS Auxiliary Corps' second target. Major General Troy had a clear numbers advantage, going up against 2 armour regiments with 6 mech regiments of his own. But it was after the main battle was concluded that the AFS got its first taste of Taurian guerrilla fighting, and yet again a planetary conquest dragged on for months. Meanwhile, on the Canopian front, the brief pause was coming to an end, and in July 2578, Manic began her second wave. The first trio of worlds she targeted were former Free Worlds planets that had broken away during the Third Andorian War. Albert the Great had been too preoccupied dealing with the Capellans to divert any of his attention, but now Marion sought to resolve the issue. The The worlds in question were fearful of retribution for their prior actions, but unbeknownst to them, Marion hoped to win their allegiance diplomatically rather than by military subjugation. To help in this endeavour, she made full use of her FWLM Auxiliary Corps, with every regiment assigned to either Pavand, Rusheg or Shuarheg, the hope being that it would look less like the conquest of an outsider and more like the return of their old allies. Marion did not send them alone, however, as beginning with the second wave, she made it her policy to concentrate at least 2 brigades per planet, and 7th Corps made its presence known. By December, the last of the resistance had been put down, and the leaders of the three worlds were invited aboard Marion's flagship, the FWLS Albert Marek. Here, she surprised all of them by offering them a choice to remain independent of the Free Worlds League as part of the Magistracy, or they could rejoin willingly. In reality, they would be consigning themselves to years of post-war military governorship had they gone with the former, but nevertheless, it set an important precedent for later political upheaval within the Marek League, and in early 2579, the Free Worlds made the first territorial gain at the Reunification War when all three agreed to rejoin.
There we go.
In 2579, Ian Cameron used his authority as First Lord to pass without debate Addendum 2 of the Ares Conventions, formally rescinding them in their entirety. In reality, the conventions were borderline defunct already, but Marion Marek continued to stress that she expected both the SLDF and FWLM under her command to act in accordance with those documents. The Outworlds Alliance during this period was not idle, and was continuing to expand its arsenal, with the bulk of its equipment coming from the Draconis Combine and the Federated Suns, two nations they were theoretically at war with.
Yeah, theoretically.
These clandestine arms deals soon came to the attention of Alexander Davian, but the First Prince saw an opportunity where his fellow council lords might have seen a threat. He dispatched his youngest son Lawrence to treat with the delegation from the Outworlds on the Alliance world of Tancredi, a world that in Alexander's youth had been the capital of the Draconis March of the Federated Suns, and the site of his Aunt Laura's final defeat during the Davian Civil War. The two nations started discussions in March, and immediately this began to bear fruit for the Periphery realm. More weapons than ever were now making their way to the Outworlds, who would continue to stockpile arms in preparation for the inevitable. Task Force Taurus's first wave finally concluded in March of 2579, with the end of the 11th month battle for Cuterville. It marked the first organised unit that the TDF had lost during the war, even if only a volunteer guard regiment, but it would set a precedent of Taurians fighting to the last man. This loss was offset by the creation of the 88th Concord Chasseurs Mech Regiment within the Pleiades cluster. Around this time, General Wexworth received orders from the MOC that his lackluster performance had been noted and was urged to show real progress soon. For now, Commanding General Lee had his back, as he understood the optimistic targets that had been set pre-war were unrealistic in the face of stiff guerrilla opposition, but the first...
And see, this is the thing, they haven't even started to try to really press in yet. They've just been... They're literally getting shit on right now on their own timetables. That whole thing, will be home before Christmas, is over. That is over.
First Lord had sold the Star League public on a short war, and the troubles on the Taurian front were proving embarrassing for him.
Really?
Wexworth began planning a major new offensive for 2580. In preparation for this, he redeployed significant numbers of his troops, too many changes to list here, but the gist of it was that the 1st and 4th Corps were taken off garrison duty to act as the sledgehammer in its next attack targeting the Pleiades cluster. Also during this time, the SLM fleets roamed up and down the line hunting for Taurians. Unfortunately, this tactic led to more losses than gains. 9 Star League warships were destroyed compared to only 5 in the Concord Navy. Only the AFFS Auxiliary Corps made an assault during 2579, taking the world of Cohagen after a 5-month battle against stubborn militia opposition. One thing Carlos Lee had not been able to provide Wexworth was replacement soldiers for those lost in the fighting. The reason for this was simple: those men and women were needed elsewhere as the Star League was about to begin Operation Mailed Fist. Major General Nathan Isaacson had been busy training fresh troops within the heart of the Inner Sphere, and now found himself being dispatched to a 4th front opening along the border with the Rimworld's Republic. Travelling with him would be the new 8th Provisional Corps, an understrength unit consisting of only 2 green divisions. Meeting him there would be the 2nd FWLM Auxiliary Corps, led by Duke Narindus Alaj, the Prince of Regulus.
This looks like a very bad idea.
In acknowledgement of the fact that this new campaign would mean trouble along the longest border the Lyran Commonwealth shared with any of its neighbours, the LCAF was not expected to provide anything more than a small auxiliary corps of its own, helmed by the Archon herself. The first draft of Operation Mailed Fist, known as Case Apollo, called for a short and direct push to the nearby Rimworld's capital to break the siege of Amaris' stronghold. Upon arriving, Isaacson realised just how unrealistic such a venture was. Though just over half of the RWA remained nominally allied, there was no telling how those units would react to SLDF troops moving within their borders.
They're probably going to get pissed
Furthermore,
off.
high tensions between the old enemies Steiner and Marek meant that there would be trouble should the Archon take command as the Captain General had done on the Canopian front. Therefore, Commanding General Lee promoted Isaacson to full general and handed command of the Rimwell's front to him. It was understood that no offensive would be undertaken until more forces could be transferred to facilitate a larger campaign than Operation Mailfist had originally envisioned.
There are 4, Mathis. There are 4. One at the northern border of the Federated Suns and the western border of Karita. Then you have this one right here, which is all along the Lyran border. You have the Capellans and the Free Worlds League down there with Canopus, and then you have the Taurians. So all 4 corners of the map.
2579 was a quiet.
Because whoever's war plan. I mean, it was really stupid. Just leave the Civil War going. The only thing they're going to do is weaken themselves at this point. Leave it alone. Take out the Northeast, then take out the Southwest, then take out the Northwest, and then focus everything on the Taurians.
Year for the war, the only significant action taking place along the Canopian front. A brief week-long campaign in March saw Obranovac fall quickly, but if anything this lulled the SLDF into a false sense of ease. When they turned their attention next to Eleusis, their offensive soon stalled as one of the largest battles Task Force Canopus would be engaged in kicked off. The MAF had amassed 4 battlement regiments on World, including most of the Chasseurs à Cheval, the first time this brigade had fought as a large unit. Supporting them were 18 armour and infantry regiments. Commanding this large task force was a senior MAF colonel, Anne Britt McMillan. All this was unknown to the SLDF, who arrived at the deserted jump points and promptly dispatched their troops towards the planet. But hidden even beyond the distant jump point was a naval carrier and a heavy consignment of aerospace fighters. Once the majority of the ships had started to move in system, the MAF launched an ambush of those transports left behind, and was able to seriously damage several of them before withdrawing into distant space. The 2-week campaign the ROC had envisioned dragged down into over 5 months of conflict, with the Magistracy units matching the performance of their inner sphere rivals. However, the newly refurbished Canopian Light Horse regiments were beginning to feel the strain by September, and though they could have continued to hold on perhaps until the end of the year, Colonel Buquois recognized that their loss would be irreplaceable and ordered a strategic withdrawal from the world on the 19th of that month. Nevertheless, they had taken the wind out of 7th Corps' sails. The only other offensive moves the SLDF made against the Magistracy within the next 12 months were the 2 short 1-month campaigns against Bethanolog in December and Gallus in January. In February 2580, General Wexworth was ready to begin the second wave of Operation Bull Run. Its target was the heavily populated, heavily developed, and heavily defended Pleiades cluster, and the 3 major worlds within. Defending this nexus was the Taurian 3rd Corps, which included the bulk of the Pleiades Hussars Brigade. Against them, the SLDF amassed almost the entirety of the 1st and 4th Corps. Assaulting such a massive cluster of stars meant naval control would be more important than ever, and to that end Wexworth assigned both the 1st and 2nd SLM battle fleets, approximately 30 warships apiece, to lead the attack. With almost half of Task Force Taurus's entire naval strength assigned to this one battle, there were few troops movements in 2580 besides this attack. Each fleet appeared at opposite ends of the cluster and began searching for the expected Concord Navy. The Taurians didn't leave them waiting long and engaged the 2nd fleet over the gas giant Archimedes. The Pleiades defense fleet was equivalent in size to one of the Star League flotillas, but they knew the 1st would be racing to the aid of their allies, so the goal was to do as much damage as possible before departing via nearby pirate points.
Right.
Over the course of the 3-day battle, each side accrued losses of more than a dozen warships, dozens more dropships, and hundreds of aerospace fighters. Even after help arrived and the Concordat ships withdrew, the Star League Navy suffered yet more casualties at the hands of so-called fire ships. This devious strategy had first been envisioned by Protector Mitchell Calderon and implemented by Marshal David Santos, and involved Taurian fanatics hidden among the moons and asteroids of the system, piloting small craft packed with explosives, sometimes even nuclear weapons, and setting suicidal collision courses with the invading vessels. 4th Corps made simultaneous landfall on all 3 major worlds on February 23rd and soon faced a determined TDF counterattack against their landing sites. Losses were extremely heavy, and they were only able to hold on to their foothold through the timely intervention of 1st Fleet orbital bombardments of enemy positions. Soon after, Wexworth sent in one of his reserve divisions to aid in the taking of the fortified manufacturing complexes. In a spinward direction, 6th Corps was moving on their own second wave objective, the industrial world of Lothair. Though both sides had committed fewer resources to the campaign over this planet, fighting on Lothair was every bit as bloody and intense as that of the Pleiades cluster. In an effort to keep the SLDF from committing any more forces, the Taurians used pirate points to sneak guerrilla forces onto many of the supposedly conquered worlds, including Anaheim, Armington, Cohagen, Somad, S1, Tentativa, and Trausen.
Now we just do a little bit of trolling.
Rebellions flared up all along the front, and many units that had been planning offensive moves now found themselves either tied down or reinforcing garrisons. By July, the rest of the reserve was committed within the Pleiades cluster, including Nicholas Cameron's company, the worst fighting you would see during the war, and by and large the TDF opposition had been crushed. Most of the Taurian 3rd Corps had been wiped out, and with them the majority of the experienced Pleiades hussars. On October 7th, Maya finally capitulated, Merope following suit soon after, and then Electra in early November. Meanwhile, the last of the Taurian Velites regiment on Lothair was eliminated, though it would take several more months for the last of the guerrilla resistance to be subdued. While 2580 was a year of climactic battles, the 4 notable planets that had been taken, though damaging to the Taurian industry, did little to change the perception that Wexworth was no longer capable of delivering a victory against the Concordat anytime soon. Rather than throw any more reserves at the problem, Carlos Lee decided that he would begin reassigning certain units currently engaged with Task Force Taurus to other fronts beginning early the next year. The situation was little better on the Canopian front, with the SLDF taking only Aspro Pyrgos in September, Fanadir in April 2581, and Borgen's Rift across September-October later that year. During this time, the MAF were copying their Taurian counterparts and launching several raids against supposedly conquered worlds and supply depots within the inner sphere, even against the largely neutral Capellan Confederation. 2581 would prove itself to be the most decisive year of the Reunification War.
Oh.
The entire complexion of the conflict would change on the Taurian front, and operations Mailed Fist and Union Hold would finally get underway. All of these events had their origins in a single engagement, the naval battle of Robsart. By this point in the war, both the Star League and Concordat navies could still field over 100 warships apiece within the Taurian theatre, and many more smaller support vessels besides. Almost all of these would soon be engaged at Robsart. David Santos, hero of Tentativa, had been recalled to Taurus the previous year to take the post of Marshal of the Navy, one of the 3 experienced commanders who would advise Senior Marshal Lucinda Grimm on overall strategy. Since taking this position, he had been responsible for the implementation of the new fireships, though he was personally opposed to what he considered to be a waste of both men and resources. Now though, the most senior naval officer at the front was Marshal Gisela Cardenas, commander of the Taurian 3rd Fleet stationed at Robsart. Another fleet was at nearby Flintoft, outfitting the system with a contingent of over 100 fireships. An even larger flotilla was currently...
I got a feeling this is gonna be... We're gonna see some serious shit here.
mustering in the Medali system for the counterattack.
And it's not gonna be good for the Star
Sphere.
League.
Star League operations began when the First Fleet moved into the Flintoff system on March 15th, where they stumbled upon the Taurian vessels. A vicious 9-hour engagement at the jump point ensued, which saw the SLN lose 16 warships, approximately half of First Fleet. The Taurians were equally bloodied, losing 9 warships of their own, along with dozens of dropships, and over 100 of the fireships that they had only just brought to Flintoft.
Oof.
As the Concord Navy was withdrawing, a second engagement was just beginning at Robsart. Admiral Janissa Franklin was the highest ranking officer representing the SLN on the front, and third in command of Operation Bull Run.
Later, Caden.
She arrived at Robsart Nadir Point at the head of one of the Star League fleets, and was set upon by a small armada of fireships and 11 dropships. Every one of these was wiped out, but the Taurians succeeded in disabling 2 warships and destroying several smaller craft. Taking a moment to catch her breath, Franklin soon discovered the presence of Marshal Cardenas, whose third fleet was deep within the Robsart system. Battle was not immediately joined between the two fleets, giving them time to assess their situation. Both knew that they already had a significant naval strength in system, and many nearby friendly fleets they could call upon for aid, but crucially, both also lacked this knowledge about the other. Cardenas immediately began sending out messengers to the survivors of Flintoft, the strike fleet at Medali, and anyone else that could be found to join them at Robsart in the hopes of catching and destroying an entire SLM fleet. Likewise, Franklin dispatched ships to request that the unassigned battle fleet sitting in reserve jump to their aid, but because she had only just arrived herself, it took some time before her messengers could charge their drives and depart. This short delay would actually play a decisive role in the coming battle. Cardenas began moving in the direction of the Seventh World, and Franklin responded in kind. Her plan was to engage the Taurians in a holding action in orbit around this world long enough for our reinforcements to perform an extremely high-risk mass jump into orbit themselves and immediately join the battle. The Marshal was slow in her approach, allowing the Star League Admiral a chance to take up a defensive position in orbit. When the Taurian fleet finally arrived, they remained at maximum range for the first hour of combat. Cardenas had delayed on purpose, allowing the Taurian reinforcements time to materialize and begin an immediate burn towards Robsat 7, something that Franklin remained unaware of until the Medali strike fleet began appearing over the horizon.
Oof.
Now the tables turned. The SLN maintained a firepower advantage on an individual ship basis, but they were outnumbered 2-1. Nevertheless, they made the Taurians pay, destroying over the next 6 hours a quarter of the combined Concordat fleet, twice their own casualties. The two sides disengaged, but another short long-range encounter happened soon after. 25 hours after the first shots had been fired, the SLN reinforcements began appearing around the planet. Their close proximity gave Cardenas only a handful of hours before they would be close enough to reinforce Franklin, so the Marshal re-engaged while she still maintained a numbers advantage, and drew the combat into a large dust cloud, within which both fleets broke down into smaller squadrons and fought at close range. The dust cloud made communications extremely challenging and obscured sensors. Another wave of Taurian warships and a large consignment of fireships arrived to offset the Star League Navy reinforcements, both groups entering the fray within the large Lagrangian dust cloud. This environment proved the Taurians' undoing, however, and the Marshal was not able to perform surprise flanking maneuvers as she had hoped. After a mere 5 hours, half the Taurian fleet was in ruins, and Cardenas called for a general retreat, but even this proved a challenge as they were not able to reach all of their ships engaged within the cloud. The Concord Navy performed an intra-system jump and arrived in orbit around the main world of Robsat. Some ships were too damaged to fight and withdrew entirely, and it was around this point that Marshal David Santos, commander of the Concord Navy, first started to realize just how bad the meat grinder had become. He frantically dispatched orders to what naval assets he could reach not to enter the melee at Robsat, but this was too late to stop yet another Taurian fleet from becoming embroiled. The final naval engagement began on March 30th, 2581, 1 month short of the 3-year anniversary of the declaration of war. By now, the last of the Taurian reinforcements had made their way to join Cardenas around the planet Robsat and its 3 moons, but Franklin's fleet had swelled to over 100 warships, almost the entirety of the SLN contingent of Task Force Taurus.
Oh my god.
The Taurians had all their cards on the table by this point and had no real tricks up their sleeves apart from another detachment of fireships brought in with the 3rd wave of reinforcements. The superior numbers and firepower of the Star League Navy allowed them to inflict significant damage upon their opponents. The 3-day battle drew to a close on May 2nd when Cardenas withdrew and finally left the system with what little remained of her fleet 2 days later. The naval battle of Robsat was over. In total, the Star League had deployed 120 warships against the Concordat's 100. Both sides had also fielded armadas of hundreds of dropships, many hundreds more aerospace fighters, and several hundred fireships on the Taurian side. Well over 1,000 craft had seen combat. The Concord Navy had suffered irreplaceable casualties, a total of more than 70 warships lost, 80 including those at Flintoft. The Taurian shipyards had already been struggling to replace those lost over the prior 3 years, but this was the killing blow. Their main military strength, that of their navy, had been devastated. Only a few dozen scattered vessels remained, far too few to pose a challenge to the invaders. Through her family's close ties to the ruling Calderons, Cardenas was spared from the consequences of losing such a decisive battle. The blame instead fell on Marshal Santos, who Mitchell Calderon believed had cost them a victory by preventing further reinforcements. He was removed from office soon after. In hindsight, we can say with some confidence that even the entire Concord Navy could not have won the day. Star League casualties numbered at 30 warships, the equivalent of a full battle fleet. A further 50 had been heavily damaged and would spend the next few years out of action. Despite this, it had been a major strategic victory and losses were comparatively few compared to the Taurians or the Flintoft engagement. Crucially though, the Star League possessed fleets of hundreds more vessels within the Innersphere interior and could quickly...
At this point, the Taurians should have been out of the fight. The fact that this goes on for another 17 years...
replace the losses to bring the 4 fleets back up to full operational strength within the year, though in truth it was no longer necessary. When word of the victory reached the MOC, the response was immediate. Now that the SLDF had broken the back of the Taurians, final victory was viewed as inevitable. Despite Wexworth's objections, 3 divisions of troops had already been reassigned to Task Force Mailfist, and now that operation was given the go-ahead. Despite this, the ground invasions scheduled for that year continued as planned. The first was the invasion of Flintoft on March 27th. First Corps' landfall had freed up the First Fleet to depart the system for Robsart just in time for the final battle against the Concord Navy. A force of 300 Taurian conventional fighters kept the regular army boxed in at their landing site for a fortnight before the SLDF was finally able to win control of the skies. The 43rd Light Horse returned to the front, and along with them Captain Nicholas Cameron, who had spent the last year jumping between Wexworth and First Corps' headquarters group. The 69th Concordat Chasseurs, one of the few surviving elements of the Taurian Third Corps, managed to resist until late July before they were all but eliminated. Even still, the ever-present guerrilla forces dragged the campaign on for another 11 months, during which time Nicholas moved up to the position of battalion commander. The invasion of Robsart began on April 30th when the SLDF Third Corps made landfall. They had been patiently waiting at the Nadir jump point for several weeks while Admiral Janissa Franklin waged war on the Concord Navy. Upon their arrival, however, they were horrified to discover that Franklin had occupied her time by ordering the orbital bombardment of every city on the planet. The Admiral had been outraged at the loss of so many of her warships, especially to the suicidal fireships the Taurians had employed. Now she viewed every civilian as a potential suicide bomber, and took action to eliminate as many as possible. Over 20,000 died before Third Corps took over operations, including the planet's TDF defenders, the 1st and 90th Concordat Chasseurs, the latter having only just been formed a few months earlier. The survivors were anything but submissive, however. Most had lost their homes and families, and were now spurred into a frenzy with no regard for their own safety. Human wave attacks were common, many of the civilians attacking with little more than bits of rubble and debris. It was a situation that couldn't last though. By the end of July, the fight had gone out of them, and the last of the resistance was mopped up the following month. A major humanitarian effort began soon after, but by this point the death toll was in the millions.
Well, what do you think's going to happen when you open up by bombarding their cities because you got you didn't win the way that you wanted to? You lost ships. Take the win and go. Take the win and just go. And you literally won. Like, at this point you won the war, but instead you jump into the system and start bombarding everything. You're an idiot. You're a damned idiot.
Robsart radicalized the entire Taurian Concordat. While the naval battle might have signaled the beginning of the end, the orbital bombardment spurred the populace onto ever greater acts of defiance and sacrifice. Wexworth had been one of the few holdouts still trying to enforce the Ares Conventions, but now he faced an opponent that would use every measure available to them. The General requested Admiral Franklin report and explain her actions when he learned of the severity of the situation on Robsart, but Franklin never gave him the opportunity to remove her from command. Forming an ad hoc naval task force of loyal ships and captains, the Admiral effectively went rogue and began an 18-month campaign to track down the surviving Taurian warships and wipe them out.
God.
She never succeeded in this task, but her efforts were at least responsible for the destruction of several squadrons of fireships around a number of as-yet unattacked systems. When she finally returned to the fold, her court-martial absolved her of any wrongdoing, allowing her to continue her career in a high administrative position. With the main body of the fighting coming to an end on Flintoff and Robsart, it was time for the next assaults, beginning with an attack on Brusset on July 2nd and followed up a month.
Of course, because it's not a war crime when you win, you know.
Month later at Werfer. Both worlds were garrisoned by a volunteer guard battlement regiment and a strong heavy armor support force. Furthermore, 2 battalions of infantry commanders were dispatched to Diefenbaker aboard captured Taurian vessels from the Robsart engagement that would allow them to infiltrate key power and communication centres without drawing attention to themselves. 10th Division found the main population centres on Brusset mostly abandoned, thinking the Taurians had fled to avoid a repeat of the orbital bombardments they had suffered a few months earlier. However, the truth soon became apparent when the entire division began to show signs of sickness. The Taurians had poisoned all the major water supplies on world and now descended on the stricken SLDF forces.
Oh, wow.
A full 3/4 of the unit, some 6,000 men and women in total, died as a result of the poisoning or by direct assault, including the commanding lieutenant general. Only orbital strikes from their naval escort were able to hold back the attacking TDF troops. At Werfer, the SLDF fell victim to radiological and chemical weapons that killed both sides indiscriminately. Such weapons were now used freely in the aftermath of Robsart. Fighting on Brusset and Werfer drew on into late 2582, during which time the volunteer guard forces were utterly destroyed. The main assault on Diefenbaker began on August 9th, using troops culled from the invasion of Flintoff and Robsart. Within a month, all the major industrial sites and population centres were under Starleague control. The 2nd Taurian Guard had been all but eliminated by November, leaving only a militia general offering any organised resistance. The final battle took place in December, high in the Corrigan Hills, and was an all-infantry affair. After a month of fighting tooth and nail, the SLDF, spearheaded by the 88th Light Horse, finally broke through, only to discover that the last few hundred Taurian survivors had committed mass suicide to avoid falling into Starleague hands. The Battle of Corrigan Hills would become the stuff of legends on both sides of the war. A single regiment of Taurian militia had held off 2 divisions. The end result was a death toll of over 5,000 on the Starleague side.
Oh!
This was totally unacceptable to those back on Terra. By 2582, the war against the Concordat was about to enter its 4th year. Far from being a brief affair, all the Starleague had achieved in that time was to take possession of a mere third of the Taurian industry. The Concord Navy may have lain in ruins around Grobsart, but there was no indication that the Periphery Nation would surrender anytime soon. With Wexworth at the wheel, it seemed likely that the war might drag on for another decade. By now, the prolonged conflict was beginning to take a serious toll on those frontline units. None were at full operational strength, most were down by 40%. Casualty figures since the start of the conflict for each corps ranged from the equivalent of half their total manpower on the low end, to as high as 1.5 times their total for the worst affected. Naturally,
Oh my god, they're getting... Look, the Taurians might be going down, but my god, they're filling graves.
then few of those who had started the war were still fighting, many were green recruits. This was even true of several high-ranking officers, and in January 2582, the end came for General Charles Main's team Wexworth. The writing had been on the wall for some time, but what little support he had back on Terra had finally dissipated, and he was removed from command. His time as General of Task Force Taurus can be judged in one of 2 ways. On the one hand, he tried his best to stick to the Ares conventions to reduce civilian casualties, and he trusted in his staff of officers to carry out his orders. His biggest mistake was viewing the entire war, and by extension his command, as a means to a political end, one he ultimately failed to achieve. Most of all though, he was a victim of wildly inaccurate estimations on how much resistance the Taurians would put up. He was neither prepared for the intensity of the conflict, nor were those on Earth prepared to reassess their expectations. Someone new was needed. Until the defeat of the Concord Navy at Robsart in early 2581, the lion's share of Starleague naval assets were assigned to Task Force Taurus. This factor, more than any other, had delayed the invasions of the 2 as yet unengaged periphery realms. After Marshal Cardenas withdrew the battered remnants of her fleet, the door was thrown wide open for the commencement of Operation Mailed Fist against the Rimwell's Republic and Operation Union Hold against the Outworlds Alliance. The first actions taken by the SLDF after the naval victory at Robsart was the mass redeployment of troops across the entire Inner Sphere. 3 divisions had already crossed the Inner Sphere from their Taurian garrison to their staging posts on Chelwan. Travelling with them was 4th Corps Major General Legat, while Major General Aaron Shaw took command of 6th Corps detachment, whilst Harmon Reese remained behind with the 18th Division for their assault on Werfer. Also making the journey was a fleet of warships. The Marek Auxiliary was further reinforced with the addition of a pair of regiments from Task Force Canopus, who in turn were replaced by 2 other Fusiliers of Orient units. Comparing the strength of Task Force Mailed Fist is difficult given the civil war that was still smouldering within the Republic, but even if we take the RWA as a single entity, the SLDF had a 3-to-1 advantage both on the ground and in space. Task Force Outworlds was also receiving the extra troops Major General Furlow had been waiting for. 5th Corps had spent most of the war garrisoned within the Capellan Confederation, waiting to see if they would be required to fight either against the Ecanopians or the Taurians. Now their time to shine had arrived, and they took up positions along the Outworlds front. A DCMS Auxiliary Corps also added.
Well, if you were on these forces got redeployed, I mean, you'd probably be feeling kind of good right about now because you don't have to fight the fucking Taurians anymore.
To the strength of Operation Union Hold. Lastly, Naval Task Force 82 gave them complete control in space, as the Outworlds Alliance lacked any warships of its own. The OAM had been busy these past 2 years since their clandestine armament program had expanded with the aid of the Federated Suns. By this point, each world could now field at least 1 battalion of armoured vehicles in defence, and the 1st Alliance Battlement Regiment had expanded to 4 battalions. The old converted industrial mechs were phased out entirely for proper war machinery. The additional forces on both sides meant they maintained a relative parity in numbers, though the SLDF was certainly better equipped. By May, the SLDF reinforcements were in position. General Isaacson had a conservative 2-year plan to take a half a dozen worlds along the Corwood border before making the final attack on Apollo itself. Once the capital was under their control, he estimated it would take no more than 3 years to put an end to the Rim Provisional Government. They had more than enough resources to accomplish this modest goal. On May 9th, the first assault began on Treeline, a world garrisoned by one of the RPG units. At first, they made no efforts to contest the landing, but after the Star League commander called for their surrender, they refused and began skirmishing attacks against the far larger force. The 8th Dragoons lacked any mechs, but they used their light cavalry forces excellently to prolong the fight for 3 months, even after which small pockets of resistance continued to hold out until the end of the year. At Persistence and Star's End, the invaders faced a battalion of loyal Amaris troops and were under strict orders to keep casualties to a minimum. The Persistence garrison took up arms as soon as the SLDF entered the system and fired upon them as they attempted to make landfall. In the case of the asteroid-ridden Star's End system, the defenders went into hiding and tried to avoid a confrontation altogether. In both instances, the majority of the resistance had been dealt with by the end of the 3rd month. Notably, the Star League Navy would begin construction on a naval refit yard at Novo Cressidas, a facility that still operates in a limited capacity to this day. Last to move in this first wave was the Lyran Auxiliary Corps, who had responsibility for the defense of the SLDF's flank. No RWA units were stationed on Black Earth, so the LIC had predicted minimal resistance. However, they failed to notice the aerospace fighter detachment that would provide such a challenge to the Sky Rangers once they touched down. Across the Inner Sphere, talks between the Federated Suns and the Outworlds Alliance were continuing, and this partnership would culminate in the signing of the Tancredi Accords on June 5th.
Okay.
In exchange for the territorial ceding of a dozen border worlds, the Federation agreed to continue supplying the Periphery Nation with armaments, while also surreptitiously purchasing space on the Karitan and Starleague transports bound for occupied worlds to smuggle arms and aid to those in need once the invasion was underway. That invasion got the final go-ahead 1 month later on July 6th, and now the Starleague was officially at war with every one of the Periphery realms. Their first moves were to consolidate the gains they had made back in 2572 under Directive 21. Since then, a battalion of SLDF forces, or DCMS forces in the case of Santiago, had been stationed on each world. Apart from a changing of the guard when the 6th Corps was reassigned in 2578, very little had occurred during their occupation. Union Hold saw those battalions' parent units move in. They set about creating major staging posts, and soon after, the majority of 2nd and 5th Corps were on world. Only on Santiago was there resistance to this change. Indeed, the Outworlds would continue to fund and supply guerrilla movements on that planet even after the conclusion of the Reunification War. In the first wave of Operation Union Hold, the SLDF first took aim at 4 worlds: Bryceland, Groveld, Wyzau, and Shermack. Each had a small armour consignment of 7, 6, 4 and 5 companies respectively, and a militia infantry regiment of no more than 600. Each would soon be tasked with the impossible job of resisting a full SLDF brigade. Bryceland had the largest militia and lasted a mere 2 days before the governor surrendered on July 28th. On Shermack, the defenders were so overwhelmed that Lieutenant General Simone de Martino gave special instructions to avoid a bloodbath. It was a near bloodless contest with only a little over 100 wounded and just 11 killed in action. The 56th and 156th regiments were left behind as garrisons as the brigades prepared to move on. Defenders on Groveld and Wyzau were more tenacious. The assaults began on July 24th and August 2nd respectively. Both planets were chiefly mining worlds, which meant the population was widely dispersed in small communities. The 1st Groveld Armour Battalion held on until the end of September, while on Wyzau, the SLDF's strategy to starve out the defenders led them to turning on each other after several made favourable business contracts with their invaders. Forlo was not impressed by his subordinates' efforts to avoid bloodshed and demanded a direct assault which would ultimately lead to high casualties on both sides.
Dude.
By November 17th, the last of the 4 worlds was declared pacified. The DCMS Auxiliary Corps had one target during the first wave, the world of Tabayama. Unbeknownst to the Outworlds Alliance, Planetary Governor Hiroshi Bartusiak had secretly been conversing with his Kuritan neighbours. He hoped to retain his position of power after the inevitable conquest. Shosho Oguchi specifically requested Tabayama, believing he was onto an easy victory. Only a single Draconis regiment was dispatched, which should have been more than enough to overpower the 1 militia armour battalion. What he didn't know was that 2 more battalions of the OAM's 1st Armoured Division had taken up position on world. This was the last thing Bartusiak wanted, and he made life difficult for those forces who had ostensibly come to his aid.
Arrogance.
When the invaders arrived on August 11th, the governor immediately surrendered. One of the first locations secured by the DCMS were the starports where the OAM dropships were parked, and those forces would surely have been quickly rounded up were it not for the outraged public response to Bartusiak's surrender. All across the planet, riots flared up, which gave the OAM enough time to withdraw and consolidate. These protests soon turned violent, and the Combine forces responded in kind. Hundreds were killed before the 1st Armoured launched an attack of their own on the starport, securing it just long enough for them to retake control of their dropships and escape off-world with the 2 surviving companies and 2,000 civilians in tow. Demonstrations against Bartusiak continued into 2582 until he was replaced by a new governor from the Draconis Combine. The old traitor survived just 2 weeks without Kurita support. With 8 worlds already under Star League control, Forlo felt confident in taking the first step in his plan to end the war quickly and decisively with a direct assault on the Alliance capital of Alpharance. In theory, only a single world stood in his way, the planet Sevon. The planetary militia on this world was no greater than that he had already faced, 2 battalions of armour and 2 regiments of infantry. But Forlo suspected the OAM had a presence there too, and he wasn't wrong. 4th Division had brought a mixed regiment of their own, plus a pair of companies from the 1st Alliance Battlement Regiment and 2 squadrons of the rare Alliance aerospace fighters. On October 3rd, Forlo took personal command of the invasion at the head of 2 divisions from his own 2nd Corps. 2nd Corps had barely touched down with a small force when they received a startling communication. A man purporting to be a Davian Guards colonel claimed that Savon was a Federated Suns protectorship and that the SLDF must withdraw. Forlo rolled his eyes at this obvious ruse and commanded the handful of infantry and mech companies that had already made landfall to attack the rogue mech company. Almost instantly, the dozen mechs painted in Davian colours ballooned into a full regiment, supported by Alliance armour. Forlo was dumbstruck when within 30 minutes his advance had turned into a rout and he was pushed back to his dropships, desperately holding out while he waited for aid from the 6th Royal Division. What exactly had he stumbled into on Savon? 4 months earlier, when the Outworlds Alliance and Federated Suns signed the Tancredi Accords, a secret provision had been included that would drastically alter the course of the war. Lawrence Davian returned to his father with an understanding that the AWFS would raise a force of mercenaries to fight and defend Davian interests within the Alliance to secure land rights and future trade deals.
Wow.
Alexander had turned to his own Davian Guard looking for volunteers. Many of his most experienced and trusted troops accepted early retirement to join the ranks of this new mercenary force, and at its helm was appointed Colonel Elias Pitcairn, who in turn would become its namesake. Centuries later, the exploits of the Pitcairn Legion are still venerated by the citizens of the Federated Suns. It had taken until October to form this new unit, which now boasted 3 regiments of battle mechs and 1
It's just what the hell?
of aerospace fighters. Their arrival on Savon would transform the defense of that world, and in so doing they would become Forlo's nemesis. While Pitcairn and the OAM were laying siege to the general, the 6th Royal came under attack from the 2 other Legion regiments, while their aerospace fighters established air superiority over the battlefields. This allowed them to keep the division bottled up within their LZ, the Davian forces destroying any that ventured beyond the safety of their dropships, while daring tech crews salvaged anything that they could reach. 4th Division, who had grounded nearby, was slow in their response. Pitcairn had anticipated their arrival for hours before they eventually materialised, and the colonel was forced to withdraw. Nevertheless, it was a major victory for the OAM, their combined efforts accounting for the destruction of more than 200 tanks and battle mechs, and even 6 dropships. Forlo was outraged. From his perspective, this was an act of war by the Federated Suns against the Star League. He responded by issuing a $1 million bounty on Pitcairn's head, sure that some enterprising civilian would deal with.
So he was told, back off, this is a protectorate. He attacks anyway. He promptly catches a foot in his ass, and now he wants to be mad at everybody else about it. God, I love this guy already.
This problem for him. Not content to wait, however, 4th Division was broken into detachments and sent out to find the Pitcairn Legion, who emerged from concealed positions to score further victories over the isolated units, until both sides were dragged into a prolonged engagement at Big Tusk. By the 3rd day, every SLDF and OAM unit on the planet was engaged here. The battle drew on until October 12th, when a joint message arrived from the First Lord and First Prince that called for the 2 commanders to cease hostilities and let the situation on Savon be handled politically. An uneasy truce settled on Savon, but Forlo did not delay and called in his DCMS auxiliaries, wagering that they would have little compulsion about fighting Davian forces. On October 26th, 3 regiments of Garridan regulars made landfall, and the Star League forces quickly closed in for the kill. Pitcairn, though, had been expecting just such an eventuality. Thankfully, President Avalar's
So taking advantage of a ceasefire, that's a war crime.
orders to withdraw had come, so the defenders prepared for departure. The Legion fought a rearguard action for 2 days before finally lifting off late on the 28th. Just like on Santiago, covert shipments to guerrilla forces on Savon would leave it a contested world for the duration. On the same day, 13th Brigade was landing on Medran. This was a world with a stronger planetary militia than any other the Star League had yet encountered during Operation Union Hold. 4 armour battalions, a total of 200 vehicles, and 2 motorised infantry regiments would pose a not insignificant threat to the 3 regular army regiments making landfall. The Planetary Defense Chairman wisely avoided direct engagement during the first 2 weeks, during which time he scored a battalion's worth of mech and armor kills at the cost of one of his own comparatively lighter armor battalions. He followed this up by capturing a Star League supply dump from which he was able to arm another volunteer regiment. The defense of the city of Axel was the turning point of the campaign. The defenders were at risk of collapsing under sustained fire, but the timely arrival of Ratty's forces was able to temporarily beat back the SLDF. This came at a heavy cost, however, as only a few militia armor companies survived the battle. Mallet was now faced with the uncomfortable prospect of having to level the entire city. For now, she was content to sit back and wait for further orders from Forlo. Unfortunately for the people of Medron, Mallet's report on the situation reached Forlo just after another. Since their humiliating defeat at the Battle of Tentativa, the AFFS Auxiliary Corps on the Taurian front had been extremely slow to maneuver and was lagging well behind the SLDF. A measly 3 escort warships remained to guard their limited transports, far too few to safeguard those vessels against even the now devastated Concord Navy. For some time, Alexander Davian had been beseeching the High Council to spare more ships so that he could take an active part in the war again. With his troops now unofficially committed within the Outworlds theatre, Davian saw that the moment was right to threaten drastic action. If he did not receive naval assistance immediately, he would withdraw his forces from the war and take no further part like his neighbours in the Capellan Confederation. Ian Cameron relented, but found that the only warships that were available belonged to SLN Task Force 82, assigned to Major General Forlo. Despite the protestations of Commanding General Lee, Forlo received the orders that a full third of his navy was to be immediately reassigned. Until this point, he had held out hope of pushing on from Savon to Alpharats by year's end, but his orders left him no choice. They also left him as a swirling ball of rage. When news of Medron's continued resistance reached him, he ordered Mallet to take the most extreme action. The population of the planet was to be decimated. 1 in every 10 civilians was rounded up and executed, and it was promised that this would continue until all militia resistance surrendered.
What
It took only a few hours for the Planetary Defense Chairman to surrender, but by which time over 10,000 had already been killed. Pleased with how effective this tactic had been, Forlo made it his standing practice on all planetary occupations, something his officers had no qualms about carrying out.
Dude. This guy.
Because of this, the Outworlds campaign became one of the most costly to human life.
Like, literally, you're fighting the paper tiger of the periphery, and you have to resort to decimating the civilian population to get them to stop fighting you. You are a fucking disgrace, incompetent, and you are a massive pussy.
Back on the Rimworld's border, the Lyran Commonwealth began suffering from raiding attacks perpetrated by both the RWA and Rift Republican Army. These were little more than company-strength strikes at targets of opportunity and were quickly driven off by the alert LCAF defenders. This all changed with the shock and attack on the provincial capital of Alarion. This deep strike into Commonwealth territory managed to cause significant damage to the planet's starport facilities before the battalion of raiders were pushed back to their dropships. Despite attempts to intercept them in space, the RRA troops were able to make their escape back into the periphery. The effect of this raid was profound. The Archon had won several conceits from the Star League by playing up the dangers of antagonizing one of their neighbors, but the threat was never truly believed by the inhabitants of the Commonwealth. Suddenly, they were faced with the very real possibility of repeated attacks causing considerable damage. Viola Steiner Dinesen approached General Isaacson and demanded a change in the way they were approaching Operation Mailed Fist. Until this point, all their efforts had been focused around Apollo, leaving the Rimworld's troops within the other districts, both Rebel and Loyal, free rein to do as they pleased. The Archon wanted to see simultaneous assaults along the border, as was being done on all other fronts. This threatened to delay the invasion by years, but faced with the prospect of the Lyrans withdrawing entirely, potentially even from the Star League itself, Isaacson's hand was forced. Within a single month, operations Mailed Fist and Union Hold that had begun so promisingly were now facing years of setbacks because of the actions of 2 of the Council Lords. The Archon's efforts to keep her people safe, though perfectly reasonable to us, actually alienated her from her co-commanders, both Star League and Free Worlds. The First Prince's meddling was openly belligerent and recognised by all. Curiously, Ian Cameron never called him out on it, and there are even some insinuations that he was behind the leaks that led the OAM to reinforce Savon ahead of Forlo's arrival. By mid-December, Alexander Davian had his ships, and the stagnant AFFS Auxiliary Corps was finally ready to make some moves. The Certis Fusiliers descended on Pierce on the 22nd, while the Avalon Hussars followed it up with the invasion of Weipe 1 week later. In both instances, the Taurian defenders sacrificed many of their own citizens to delay the inevitable. Early fighting on Pierce was relatively minor until the Capellan March forces took up positions within the cities. In February, a series of enormous bombs were detonated under the surface of numerous major population centres that sunk whole structures and roads down into the sewer system. 12,000 civilians died in the initial blasts alone. The 7th Certis Fusiliers were particularly badly hit, losing more than half the regiment to those terrorist bombs. So much time was lost trying to dig their equipment out that the planet would continue to resist for a full year. On Weipe, a scorched earth policy enacted by the defenders sent thousands of tons of foodstuffs and fuel up in flames. From this dense smoke, the militia fighters would emerge and ambush the invaders. Like on Pierce though, this cloud of toxic fumes did as much damage to the natives as the Outworlders. Soon, medicine was being imported in bulk by the Federated Suns to try and deal with the humanitarian crisis.
But this is kind of what you get when you let your admiral go half-cocked and start bombing cities from orbit against a defenseless world at that point. This is kind of what happens at that point. You now have to deal with the FAFO scale because you have truly fucked around when you do this.
Final victory came in October 2582. Amos Forlo may have lost his ability to transport a large enough force to take Alpharats, but he still had ample transports to continue his advance spinward into the heart of the Outworlds Alliance. Forlo's task force began their second wave when the General ordered the dual invasions of Canard and Pitkin on January 6, 2582. Senior Chairman Welkins Nord was taken by surprise by the direction of this new attack. Both were worlds bordering the Federated Suns and outside of what was perceived as the invasion corridor. They'd had the bulk of their militia redeployed elsewhere and had barely a battalion of light armour to defend themselves. Both fell within a couple of days. Forlo's new strategy came into focus with his next choice of target, Tancredi IV. By focusing his attention along their shared border, there was no question that Forlo was seeking to isolate the two unofficial allies. The world's farmers put up little resistance, and there wasn't even a militia unit to protect them. The planet was in Starleague hands as soon as their troops made landfall. Tancredi had acted as a way station for the illegal passing of arms from the Federated Suns into the periphery for over 5 years. Still, the scope of their operation remained hidden to the Starleague despite weeks of searching. Only when a small force of dropships lifted off from a remote mountain region was the SLDF able to discover the base of operations, but found no conclusive evidence within that could be traced back to House Davian. The DCMS Auxiliary Corps was making their next move during this period. Their next target was the world of Valentina, but here they would begin to rue the cruelty of their past occupations.
Yeah.
The citizens of Valentina, faced with the prospect of another Medron, had taken a vote to determine whether to resist the Starleague when they inevitably came calling. Surrender seemed preferable, but when it was the DCMS who made landfall instead of the SLDF, the planet's population rose up in rebellion. The Curitans soon found themselves dealing with another Santiago. Unfortunately for the civilians, the invaders doubled down on their cruelty and again implemented the policy of decimation to crush resistance. Throughout the invasion of the Outworlds Alliance, one unit that was routinely underutilized was Major General Laszlo Hooker's 5th Corps. The reason for this was that Forlo simply believed that the general and his men were incompetent and tasked them with little more than garrison and rearguard in the early war. Hooker, though, was a longtime friend of Commanding General Lee and voiced his displeasure of being left on the sidelines to him. Lee's subsequent orders to the task force commander left no room for dissension. Haynesville was a relatively inconsequential world that Forlo believed that would be enough to placate his lickspittle colleague. The invasion was tasked to the 37th Royal Brigade, who made landfall on February 7th. Despite early reports indicating that the world had been pacified, a sharp uptick in militia attacks a week later left the regular army troops bruised and bloodied. The planetary militia seemed particularly adept at anti-mech and anti-armor tactics. This proficiency was a result of the efforts of Captain Joshua March, a former AFFS soldier who had become de facto leader of the resistance. His specially trained battalion racked up 24 kills and managed to evade pursuit for the first 3 weeks of the invasion. Sexton saw that he was going to need additional support to take the world and sent out a request for reinforcements. Things took a dramatic turn going into the 4th week. On the 3rd day of March, reinforcements arrived, but they weren't for the SLDF. A detachment of the Pitcairn Legion touched down and promptly linked up with the Outworlds militia. Numbers were not on their side, but the two commanders fooled Sexton into thinking he faced a far larger force. By the end of the month, the supply situation among the SLDF was so dire that the Lieutenant General was prepared to talk terms. On March 29th, he formally surrendered his brigade to the Pitcairn Legion. The militia wasted no time in taking stock of their newly acquired machinery.
Thanks for the presents!
Royal Brigade was outfitted with the most advanced technology the Starleague possessed, and now it was in the hands of the ragtag group of former farmers. On March 31st, they detected the arrival of the 39th
Russia versus Ukraine. I now have a tank to plow my fields.
9th Brigade, giving them 6 days to load up and retreat off-world, even taking Sexton's dropship squadron with them.
Dude.
When Forlow heard of what had happened, he personally departed for Haynesville. He could not believe the initial reports, but regrettably for Thomas Sexton, they had not been exaggerated. If Forlow had been angry at having to call off his attack on Alpharets the previous year, he was positively apoplectic upon discovering that the OAM had made off with 2 regiments of Texan battle mechs. In the ensuing months, Starlink intelligence would report on the formation of 2 new units on Alpharets, formed around the stolen tech, the Pitkin Legion and Santiago Carabineers. The furious general used this opportunity to clean house. Every officer within the 37th Royal Brigade above lieutenant grade was imprisoned for cowardice and dereliction of duty.
Dude!
The commander of the 13th Division and his immediate subordinate were sacked, as were 5th Corps' top brass, the Major General Laszlo Hooker. In a twist of fate, Carlos Lee would subsequently appoint Hooker as the SLDF's operations director, responsible for the creation of new strategies across all fronts. Forlow had, in effect, promoted him. Forlow's campaign along the border would have continued had it not been for the quick actions of Alexander Davian, who again dispatched his son Lawrence to come to an agreement with Ambassador Considine on Hazelhurst. 5 of the planets that had been promised to the Federated Sons were promptly garrisoned by Davian troops. It was a peaceful occupation, and one that would avoid retaliation from Forlow for the time being.
For the time being, nice.
A few months earlier on the Taurian front, General Charles Mainstein Wexworth's tenure as the commander of Operation Bull Run was coming to an end. On January 17th, his replacement arrived and immediately relieved him of office. General Amalthea Kincaid was something of a protege to the commanding general, and at the time of her promotion to the head of Strategic Simulations Command in 2577, was the youngest full general in the SLDF. Kincaid has spent most of her career in various staff positions on account of her near-fatal encounter with Pingree fever that had left her physically disabled, but her military mind was one of the sharpest, and it was hoped she would revolutionise the campaign against the Taurian Concordat. Her first actions were to reorganise all the units under her command. She had brought with her a sizable force of replacements that allowed her to fill in the gaps within her units, but also took this opportunity to change their internal structure, beginning the transition within the SLDF from combined arms mixed regiments into focused single-type units. Lastly, she plucked from the various corps battalions that had distinguished themselves and formed them into a new provisional brigade. This new unit, known as the Striker Brigade, was under the command of her Chief of Staff, Elias Priest. These changes would take time, so while her force was reorganising, Kincaid dispatched 1st, 2nd and 3rd Fleets in late February to clear the path towards her first wave of targets. The 1st swept through the Bromhead system, while 3rd spent more than a month tracking down elusive fireships around Rollis. But the main goal was Horsham, one of the last Taurian shipyards outside of the Hyades cluster and the source of the dreaded fireships. Many of these suicidal vessels were present in the system, along with a small flotilla of defence dropships. Around the orbital facilities were a trio of the now scarce Taurian warships, a 2nd squadron covering the Nadir shipyards. The SLN spent most of February covertly monitoring the system, and on the 21st saw an opportunity when 2 more warships materialised at the Nadir and docked for repairs. 2nd Fleet arrived at the jump point en masse, and spent the next 2 days laying waste to the Concord Navy. All 5 of the precious warships were destroyed, along with dozens of smaller vessels, as were the shipyards themselves, though this was due to Taurian saboteurs. Pekatoru cleared the system's zenith before heading towards the main world, along the way catching the 2nd warship squadron and racking up another 3 kills. Elsewhere on the front, one of Wexworth's final initiatives was put into action by the new general. Kincaid lost the 6th Corps to the Rimworld's front almost immediately, and the remainder of this 4th Corps was expected to depart as soon as possible. Wexworth had hoped to keep them tied down by ordering an attack on the heavily defended Carmichael, a plan that Kincaid saw the good sense in. Therefore, the attack commenced on March 8th. Carmichael was always going to be an exercise in patience for any attacker. The world was abundant in rich ore veins, but this meant the population was dispersed across hundreds of small mining communities. The surface was an extremely unpleasant place, and powerful storms made air support an impossibility.
Yes.
All this meant a very, very long battle lay ahead for 4th Corps. By year's end, 10 months of fighting had succeeded in subjugating around 10% of the planet's quarter-million population.
Oh, God.
Back in March, Kincaid's recruiting spree had made possible the formation of an entirely new unit that would go some way to offsetting the loss of 4 divisions to General Isaacson's Rimworld's campaign. The 11th Provisional Corps would have the new Striker Brigade at its head, while Priest was promoted to Major General and given overall command. 3 more brigades would fill out the remainder of the understrength 31st and 32nd Divisions. To avoid future confusion, it's worth noting now that the Task Force Tortoise RFC created this new unit without proper diligence, as there was by this point already a 31st and 32nd Division fighting with the 8th Provisional, and so the 11th was actually the 12th SLDF Corps. Thankfully, the units were on opposite ends of the Unisphere, and the discrepancy was resolved post-war. 11th Corps got their combat debut on March 13th with the attack on Bromhead. This heavily industrialised world was a major supplier of heavy armour for the TDF. The attack began with an extremely aggressive drop right on top of the strongest offensive, something that would become the hallmark of the 11th Provisional. Though the initial strikes went well, they soon ran into heavy opposition. The defenders activated 4 regiments of tanks awaiting shipment off-world, and used them to deadly effect. The 92nd Brigade took 50% casualties before taking the world. Things went no better on Rollis, source of petrochemicals used across the Concordat. The invasion started on March 29th, and as before met with early success. One of the few intact industrial centres captured by the SLDF was taken by the 94th Brigade during their landing. But on June 9th, Taurian forces broke through the line, and the ensuing battle caused an enormous chemical spill that immediately brought widespread misery to the planet. Furthermore, this accidental disaster effectively removed the restraints from deliberate chemical weapon attacks, and many more followed. The effects on the planet and its inhabitants were appalling, and the SLDF fared little better. The strikers finally saw action on April 9th when they arrived at Horsham. Bakatoro and De Cos demonstrated a masterclass in teamwork between the Navy and regular army, and systematically dismantled the planet's defenders over the course of the next 5 months, taking several production centres intact, complete with their workforce. Both Horsham and Bromhead fell in September, whereupon reinforcements were sent to finish the campaign on Rollis by the end of the year. The 11th Provisional had acquitted themselves well, the Striker Brigade especially proving to be an elite force right out of the gate. Between them, they had succeeded in wiping out the remainder of the Taurian 2nd Corps, which would not reform until after the war. However, casualties suffered by the 11th numbered over 10,000, a tall price to pay for only 3 worlds taken. The only other conquest came from the AFFS auxiliaries, who took Verdigris after 6 months of skirmishing. But what of 1st and 3rd Corps? They were held in reserve throughout 2582, after several Starleague and Davian intelligence missions were ambushed and destroyed in the Spinwood regions of the Concordat. Several incursions into the Inner Sphere resulted in the loss of 5 supply convoys and led Kincaid to believe a counterattack was imminent, but for the time being she was unsure where it would arrive.
Oh boy. We're going to stop there for tonight, Warpugs. We're going to stop here for tonight. We're going to pick this up next week, okay? We're going to pick this up next week right around here. Guys, the level of casualties the SLDF is taking here is nightmarish. Yeah, you're winning, but they are being bled like nobody's business. This is just a beating. It's honestly, the SLDF and the Inner Sphere went about, 10 more years to go. 10 more years to go. And they have done themselves so dirty here. If they would have, like, this was managed piss poor. This was managed so absolutely piss poor, it's not even funny. Yeah, it's a Pyrrhic victory on every front they have. Every front they have, like, they're losing their ass. Omega, I don't watch wrestling ever since John Cena's been there. Yeah, there's no coordination. It's not even Space Vietnam, Hakan. This is the level of just, it's a mixture of arrogance and just extremely stupid tactical decisions. They should have started off in the Galactic Northeast and wiped it out. Instead, they let it arm. They let it arm, and they kept on letting it arm to the point where when they invaded, they actually face a resistance. And now they're doing themselves no favors by proving to the people that are there that they can't be trusted. It's yeah. The Starleague has no control of their commanders. They have fought this war in a manner that is just stupid. if you handed me control of this war, the first thing I would have done was sledgehammer down the Galactic Northeast, completely pacify it, and then I'd let the outer, because if you sit there and you just let the rim worlds, the rim worlds, it's so stupid. It's so stupid. Yeah. Well, I don't know about that, Emperor. I don't know. Because at that point, like, if you take out the other ones, you're not splitting your forces anymore, and then you hold such a numeric superiority against the Taurians that you can pretty much do anything that you need to do. You just all you have to do at that point is draw the Taurian navy into a large scale battle and win. And once you take out the Taurian navy, you can just split your forces up and do what you need to do at that point. It is, yeah, the houses are still too divided, but still, it's so badly managed at this point. This war has gone on for years longer than it really should have, especially after the Taurians lost the bulk of their navy. Yeah. The second the Taurians lost control of their navy, at that point, they should have just went in, wiped out, like sent the navy in, sent their entire navy there to wipe out the Taurians' presence in space, and then at that point you just take the world's piecemeal. There's nothing they can do. Yeah, literally let a Moscow full war crime. Well, no, I don't agree with that, Box, because the Taurians are already whipped up into a frenzy now. And the SLDF and the Inner Sphere are taking so many damn losses against the Taurians, and it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse once the Taurians start really, really losing the war. Ugh. It's just a Locke, if you wipe out the Galactic Northeast back before you even declare, like, because they went in against Canopus first. For some reason, they went against Canopus first, and then they went against the Taurians. They started screwing around with periphery, and then they went to the Galactic Northeast. If you go to the Galactic Northeast first before they really have a chance to arm, you just sweep the worlds out of the way, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. I know they wanted the cat girls, but it's stupid, man. It's absolutely stupid. Now they've got a four-front war going on, and the pushover of the entire thing, it's just dumb. It's just dumb. The pushover in the Galactic Northeast is now a bastion. That's dumb. They should have wiped them out right out of the gate. It should have been done. I don't understand why. It's just ridiculous. Dude, the Taurians were still just beating the crap out of them, you know? Medical tech and the Taurians, yeah, pretty much. Davians, Cappies, Caridans keep a guard up, deal with the Rimworld Republic, leave Canopus and OWA with garrisons at possible points where the guys were attacked. Yeah. Yeah, Box, you say you deal with the Concordant and then work from there. You don't even have to worry about the Outer Worlds Alliance. You just don't have to worry about them. They don't have a fucking navy. None of these guys have a fucking navy. None of them have a fucking navy except for the Taurians. So why are you screwing with them? Yeah. Why are you screwing with them? The OWA has no navy. They had no navy. You beat the Taurians' navy. You have space superiority at that point. The RimWorld had a Navy, Locke, but I mean, Locke, you know what I'm talking about. Compared to everyone else, the Outer Worlds Alliance had no Navy to speak of, no ships, period. The RimWorld had a Navy, but it was comparatively small. The only problem with the RimWorld was the size of the border that they shared with the Concordant. I mean, with the Lyrians. Canopus had a Navy, a small one. Locke, I think you're getting confused. Yeah, it's the most idiotic method possible. So why wouldn't they just sit there and flood, like at the initial start when the war was going to, and they knew they were going to do it, flood the Outer Worlds Alliance and then leave garrisoning forces there. You have everything taken care of at that point, force the surrender and the capitulation, and then instead of fighting a 4-front war, you're fighting a 3-front war. You don't have to invest in ships. It's just a... Okay, Locke. I'm not gonna argue with you, dude. Locke is a contrarian. It is what it is. In any case, we're gonna pick this up next week. Until then, he's screwing them because of that. He is being an asshole about it, but it's still a piss poor way to run a war. It's still a piss poor way to run a war. Why leave a front open when you could have slammed it shut within no time whatsoever? I don't know. Warpugs, I'm going to take off out of here. I hope you guys have a good night. I will see you guys next Tuesday for the end of this. And I'll catch you guys later. I'm going to put that song back up because I really, really like it. I really, really like that song. So I'm going to put that one back on for the outro. I liked it. So, yeah. Let's do it. I'll catch you guys next time.
Warpugs march to the sound of thunder. Taurian banners raised high asunder. Steel on steel, you hear the echoes roar. Good times rhymes with war crimes evermore. Get off our lawn, Starlink scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. Warpugs thunder through the haze. From dusty plains to the jagged peaks, we guard our home through fire and sleet. No concordant will kneel or bow. Our cause is just, our time is now. Get off our lawn, Starlink scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. Warpugs thunder through the haze. We're snarling thunder, relentless charge. Our anthem shakes the void at large.